It's all yours, Kim. Thanks.
Okay. Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. And thank you so very much for joining us today. This afternoon, the board is hosting a roundtable examining Social Security service to the public. Through this roundtable, our aim is to share research on how the COVID-19 pandemic is affecting Social Security and the people who access its services, identify underserved populations and relevant research questions for inclusion in Social Security's learning agenda, and demonstrate how Social Security can use customer service experience data to improve public service. We have two panels. The first will be moderated by my board colleague, Bob Jundeff, and it's focused on the COVID-19 landscape. The second panel, which I will be moderating, will focus on developing evidence on underserved populations. The first panel is more presentation-based, whereas the second is more of an open discussion. And there'll be a 15-minute break in between the two panels. Jagadish Gokhale, board member, will also wrap up the day with discussant remarks. Nancy Altman is going to be taking her turn as moderator tomorrow at our IT speaker series, which all of you, of course, are invited to attend. And you may join us by registering on our website. Innocent plug there for the next session. Our panelists include former and current public servants from SSA, OMB, and GAO, researchers who receive funding from each of SSA's 3 retirement and disability research consortium centers, and attorney advocates representing people with disabilities and older people with low incomes. We are also delighted that 2 field office managers agreed to serve as technical experts throughout the roundtable. These experts from the National Council of Social Security Management Associations are David Lescarini and Peggy Murphy. They are on hand to answer any questions should they arise. And I want to be sure to thank you both, David and Peggy, for joining us. We convened our experts to help address a central question: how should the agency determine the optimal mix of services without compromising different population needs? Our roundtable is well timed as the agency considers reopening from the pandemic, is launching outreach initiatives, developing a new strategic plan, and drafting its first learning agenda, critical agency-wide questions to advance its mission. Moreover, in line with the January 20th executive order, SSA must assess whether underserved communities face systematic barriers in accessing benefits and submit a plan to OMB to address those barriers. As the agency proceeds with these initiatives, we are delighted that Social Security executives tasked with drafting the learning agenda and assessing underserved populations agreed to attend and listen to this session. Before we start, a few more logistics. Please note that the information presented here is to inform the board. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any board member. Also, we are recording this presentation and we will post it to our website at ssab.gov if you miss anything or want to share it with someone else. Throughout the day, please submit questions via the Zoom Q&A function or email us at event@ssab.gov or tweet us at @ssabgov. Lastly, if you have any feedback, we welcome it. And please email event@ssab.gov with your feedback. On behalf of the board again, thank you to our panelists, our experts, and to our audience for joining us for this important discussion. I'll now turn it over to Bob.
Thanks, Kim. My name is Bob Jundeff, and I am a board member, and I want to thank very much. We're very fortunate to have 3 wonderful speakers to talk about the challenges that COVID-19 has presented us all. We're going to have presentations of about 15 minutes by each speaker with a few follow-up questions from me. And then at the end of those 3 presentations, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And so first of all, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Curta, the Director of Education, Workforce, and Income Security at GAO. Elizabeth?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Today, I'm going to be talking about SSA's service delivery during the COVID-19 pandemic. The information I'll be discussing today was included as part of an enclosure in GAO's November CARES Act report. These are reports that GAO was or has been producing regularly to update the Congress on the federal government's response to COVID. The scope of this presentation focuses primarily on disability. We are currently working on a broader study on SSA's response to the pandemic, which will cover SSA service delivery more broadly. My presentation today will cover 4 key areas: the CARES Act funding, how SSA spent and allocated these funds, the steps that SSA took in response to the pandemic, challenges we heard about through surveys of disability determination service administrators in the states and administrative law judges, and trends in productivity at the initial claims and hearings levels of SSA's disability determination process. So SSA received $300 million under the CARES Act to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. According to SSA officials, SSA used most of this money to pay for the salaries and benefits of staff who normally conduct program integrity work that was suspended for the first several months of the pandemic. They also reported using the CARES Act funding to cover leave for staff unable to telework and other COVID-19 related expenses, including information technology to expand telework. SSA has taken a number of steps in response to the pandemic. In March of last year, it closed all of its public-facing offices, including the field and hearing offices, except for very limited in-office appointments for critical services. SSA encouraged individuals seeking assistance from these offices to first try to use their online and telephone services. At the hearings level, they halted all in-person hearings and conducted hearings by phone when claimants consented to do that. It was all on a voluntary basis. More recently, they are rolling out a video hearing option for some claimants. They also temporarily suspended referrals for in-person consultative exams for claimants at both the initial and hearings levels until they released a framework for resuming in-person consultative exams on a voluntary basis beginning last May. So we surveyed all 52 DDS administrators about the extent to which they were able to provide continuous service delivery and the challenges they faced. We learned that their experiences varied extensively. Specifically, 9 DDSs reported shutting down for some period of time. All of them reported reducing the number of staff on site. 27 reported that their staff worked alternative shifts, and 51 reported that their staff teleworked off-site. The administrators we surveyed cited 2 main challenges with transitioning to a telework environment. And these questions that we asked were open-ended questions that asked them about what additional context would your DDS like to provide about how COVID-19 affected operations. So first, 10 DDS administrators cited technology challenges. For example, one said that their staff did not have access to technology needed to telework, such as laptops and other related equipment. And second, 8 DDS administrators reported not being able to schedule consultative medical exams and that it affected their operations. We know that SSA issued guidance on using virtual consultative exams in certain situations where a physical examination wasn't necessary, such as for certain psychological exams. SSA reported that by last June, 33 DDSs had resumed scheduling in-person consultative exams, and by September of 2020, all DDSs were doing so. So what did all of this mean for productivity at the initial level? Not surprisingly, at the initial level, from March to September of 2020, initial level claims processing declined compared to the same period of the prior year, and the number of pending cases grew. According to data we analyzed, the average number of initial determinations processed per month during this period was about 152,000, or a 23% decline from the previous year's average of about 198,000 claims per month. From March through September, new disability claims decreased somewhat, about 14% compared to the same period last year. As others have reported, this is probably due to the decline in SSI applications during the pandemic. But since the decrease in determinations was greater than the decrease in new claims, pending claims generally increased. Specifically, the number of pending claims at the end of September was 21% higher than in February of 2020. So what about the hearings level? In a survey of ALJs we conducted, located in 6 hearing offices, we asked how the pandemic was affecting ALJs' ability to meet productivity goals. Of the 53 ALJs who responded, 39 reported challenges with claimants declining phone hearings. This issue did improve over the last few months, according to SSA, and at the beginning of the pandemic, about 1 in 4 claimants were declining phone hearings. However, in October, that was down to about 1 in 10. 17 of the ALJs who responded to the survey reported challenges reaching claimants, either to set up the hearing or at the time of the hearing. For example, one judge stated that staff faced challenges contacting the claimant prior to hearings, while another cited challenges locating the claimant at the time of the hearings. 16 cited limitations with technology, 9 said that phone hearings took longer to conduct, and 8 cited challenges obtaining medical evidence or consultative exams. They all said that they were scheduling hearings for cases that involved paper records, which represent about 4% of cases. Here, SSA also noted that they were taking steps to overcome this issue by scanning paper-based workloads so that staff could develop them remotely. So how did this affect productivity at the hearings level? Again, perhaps unsurprisingly, the daily average hearings in a given week fell dramatically during the first months of the pandemic compared to past months. Between the week of March 20th and October 16th of 2020, the average number of hearings per day ranged from 967 to 2,045. In contrast, during the first 5 months of between October of 2019 and March of 2020, the average number of hearings per day was 2,228. You see on this figure that the average daily number of hearings held took a steep dive in March at the very beginning of the pandemic, but bounced around, trending upwards gradually through mid-October. SSA officials noted that over this period, they reduced their pending workloads at the hearings level. GAO will continue to be tracking these trends in the coming months. Of course, a number of factors will affect SSA's workloads that are still unknown. For example, we have yet to see how the recession will affect disability claims. After the Great Recession, for example, there was a spike in disability claims. Again, we'll be actively tracking this in the coming months and reporting out on this in future work. The findings that I covered today are presented in the report that's listed here. It's actually an enclosure in a much larger report, so you kind of have to look around for the enclosures, and it'll be one of numerous that are listed at the end of the report. As I noted, GAO is continuing to examine the federal response to the pandemic, including that of SSA, over the next year. So please stay tuned, and you'll be seeing an additional report on this topic. Thank you. And I'm accompanied today by Erin Gotlin and Chris Zabrozek, who will be happy to help me answer any questions.
Thanks. I do have one question for right now, Elizabeth, and it has to do with the disability application process. So as Social Security looks forward to a potential increase in disability applications and an escalating number of retirees, how should the agency prepare to confront those challenges, especially given GAO's longstanding designation of disability administration as a high-risk program?
That's a great question. And I know we did some work on this a couple of years ago where we looked at both, their sort of, office space configurations, or as things are opening up, the office, in-person services that are available, but also the online services and the quality of those online services. And we had a lot to say about how they really weren't planning very strategically for how to deliver services as efficiently as possible, over sort of online virtual kinds of services, as well as the in-person services. And so, we would expect them to kind of, look at this strategically and think about, how best to deliver services, and are their current online services really, doing the trick? I mean, are they well designed to, especially to a population that may not be able to access online services? So what are they doing to make sure those in-person services are available to at least, some of the population that cannot always get access to things online? I don't know if Erin, if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
No, I think I absolutely agree. It's a great question. And we do have 2 open recommendations from that report. It was on their facilities planning. And we looked at the different alternatives for remote service delivery. And what we found was that SSA was not cataloging the data on complaints related to the various service delivery mechanisms. So it was not doing the best job of evaluating the effectiveness of each of those different channels and improving them. So we asked them to take a look at that. And we also asked them to adopt some metrics so that they would have a better sense of goals related to the rollout of these different service delivery options, as well as whether they were meeting those goals.
Thanks, that's great. We're going to be probably circling back to you toward the end of the session, so hang in there. There may be more questions. Next up is Steve Goss, the Chief Actuary from SSA. Are you there, Steve?
I am indeed. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Fantastic. Okay, Bob, well, thank you very much. First, let me just start by saying, as you all are probably aware, the work we do for projecting the overall solvency and cost implications for Social Security and SSI is ongoing. We did, as of November 24 of last year, develop an update to the 2020 trustees report, taking sort of a first shot at reflecting what the implications of the pandemic have been known to date at that point, not just for applications, but really what has been the larger effect. And I think Sarah will be talking more about this after me, about the larger implications really being in terms of the workforce and revenue coming into the USDI program. But what I've been asked to talk about today a little bit is about an update on applications receipts, especially at disability determination services for disability at Social Security Administration that we work on. And I would just say that I am happy to be in a position to be able to report to you some of the actual experience that we've been having regarding the actual responses and what has been done administratively at SSA. I would refer you to a recent very nice hearing that Grace Kim did with the Senate Finance Committee, where she went into some depth and detail on this area. So SSA data, which if we could flip to the next slide, SSA data that we have available to you all. The data that you see here graphed are data directly available right up on the web at the web page indicated below. And what you see here is the not surprising effect that Elizabeth already referred to, which is that as we got into March of 2020 and thereafter, we have seen some reduction in the level of monthly disability applications receipts. And on the left side here, we're seeing for the Social Security OSDI receipts. And on the right side, we have the SSI adult receipts. And you can see some drop off after March, not a real surprise for all the reasons that Elizabeth well described. And I guess I would just add a little bit to some of the items that Elizabeth was referring to. There's obviously the extended unemployment compensation and relief payments under CARES, and more recently under the ARP, the recovery plan. And these obviously have effects because as we saw in the Great Recession, after the recession started, we did not start to see increases in disability claims until after the extended unemployment was available. And under this recession, which is really a pandemic recession, quite unique in our experience, since none of us remember very well back to 1918. This is new and unique, and so we are not surprised to see somewhat different experience than we've had under normal economic recessions. In addition to some of the points that Elizabeth was referring to, obviously individuals have had an effect on their access to health providers and health records, access to representatives and assistance from representatives, in addition to influence on access to SSA, as Elizabeth mentioned. There's also, we believe, probably some impact in the applications here on the basis in this pandemic of initially and still an expectation of the pandemic being relatively short-lived and temporary as compared to an economic recession of the type that we had last time that extended for a while. The relative brevity of the economic recession with a rather dramatic increase back in GDP and even employment after the second calendar quarter of 2020 is evidence of that. Over the longer term, of course, we try to pay very careful attention to what has been happening to applications for disability, for retirement, for all aspects of our programs, and keep in mind the kinds of conditions that are operating. If we flip to the next slide, you can see over a longer term view what has actually been happening with disability receipts. And you can see here, rather than just looking at 2019 to 2020 and seeing that small drop, you can see ever since about 2010, the very, very substantial decline that we have been having in disability receipts, both for Social Security, OSDI, and for SSI age of receipts. This has been declining quite steadily throughout the period. And why is this? Well, we did reach a peak in the last recession, obviously after the extended unemployment had been completed, and we saw some increase in the applications, and we will be expecting to see the same as the extended unemployment and the ARP benefits wane going into the future. We will expect to see a similar surge coming up to a degree in the not too distant future. But what we see here, this decline that we've seen even after the surge last time, suggests a number of things. One thing that we're well aware of is that the nature of employment in our economy has been changing somewhat, and obviously dramatically so in the time of the pandemic recession. Many more people are in a position where they can continue just working at home. They don't even have travel time anymore, so things are really quite changed. This likely has some impact not only on disability application receipts, but also likely on retirement receipts as well. Continuing to work for a longer period of time has not been a problem, and arguably delay in applications for any of these benefits has no question been enhanced by virtue of the fact that we have had the extended unemployment and the relief payments. In addition, there is one other factor that I would want to point out, and that is on the next slide. On the next slide, one thing that we see is, this is a slide that some have seen, and thank you, Conway, for even increasing contrast on this slide so that it's even more visible and evident. What you see in the middle bright red band here, this is the share of the adult population 25 and older that is at ages 45 to 64. We often refer to as sort of the primary ages, the prime ages at which disability incidence occurs and therefore disability applications. You can see between 1970 and 1990, the share of the adult population that was at these ages was declining, but between 1990 and 2010, the share was increasing very dramatically, thereby resulting in big increases in numbers of people filing for and starting to receive disability benefits. Obviously, understanding demographics and all of us looking at population projections, we knew that that was a temporary factor, and after about 2008, we knew that that would be reversing, and lo and behold, it has. You can see the share of especially the population under 65, that is in the red band, is now shrinking. It has been since 2008, and in fact, I believe 2018 in our projections is the year at which we actually started to have an absolute decline in the number of people in our population from one year to the next at ages 45 to 64. So the fact that we've seen some decrease generally since 2008 in the number of people filing for disability benefits is not really a great surprise. So just wanted to share these thoughts with you. Obviously, we have a long way to go, and our expectations, as you will see, if you take a peek at our website for our November 24 update to the 2020 Trustees Report, you will see the expectation we have of having increased disability applications and benefit receipts as we get past the worst of the pandemic. Exactly when that will be is not entirely clear, but we are expecting that will be in the not too distant future, especially with the latest calls from CDC. So with that, let me close, and I assume pass the baton back to Bob and to Sarah.
Thanks, Steve. I do have one question right now, which is if there's any evidence that indicates that Americans may be delaying disability or retirement claiming.
Our primary evidence on that really is just observing what's happened in the past. We knew and we modeled it, dare I say, successfully in the Great Recession, that during the period of extended unemployment, we did not see any rise in disability applications until about a year after really the recession and the unemployment rate started to rise. So we do understand, and we have seen historically, that there is a tendency for people who apply for disability benefits of Social Security in the time of a recession, or just even in general, people who might apply who have been in unemployed status tend to wait to apply very often until after the unemployment compensation has ended. So with the extended unemployment compensation and the relief payments that we are seeing here, even more than in the Great Recession, we're not surprised to see sort of a delay in the sort of coming back of disability applications. We are anticipating that that there will be a resurgence once we get towards the end of this year and probably before.
Thanks, Steve. Now we're going to move along to Sarah Stith, who's an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico. And take it away, Sarah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Sarah Stith from the University of New Mexico. Let me just figure out how to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me open to presentation. Oops, I'm at the end of my presentation. Hold on 1 second. I was practicing before the call. All right. So I think that this work is going to fit in really well with the last two presentations. And I think together, sort of across the three, there's really just going to be a lot of information to kind of bring together and sort of reach some preliminary conclusions, at least. So this is work on the impact of COVID-19 on older workers' employment and Social Security spillovers. This is joint work with Gopi Shah Goda from Stanford University and NBER, Emily Jackson from NBER, and Lauren Nicholas from the University of Colorado School of Public Health. As stated previously, this is the work here is all the conclusions and opinions herein are those of the authors and not of the RDRC at NBER that approved the project or the Social Security Administration that ultimately funded it. Now, our motivation for this paper or this project was that COVID-19, the global pandemic, and associated risk mitigation policies created unprecedented economic and social disruption, and this was a particular threat to older individuals' work attachment. There were higher rates of mortality among those at older ages. Older individuals have been shown to be more vulnerable to permanent labor market exits during recessions, was shown after the Great Recession. And they're also more likely to simply be eligible for disability or retirement than younger populations. So why does this matter for Social Security? So the sort of obvious hypothesis or expectation is if there's a reduction in employment and labor force participation, this could translate into increased disability and retirement claiming. And the reasons for this are sort of coming from the supply side and the demand side in the labor markets. So I'm kind of more on the supply side. We have individuals who are afraid of going to work, fear of COVID, difficulties with working remotely, who are then out of the labor force and choose to claim retirement or disability. On the labor demand side, so on the firm side more, there were these shutdowns, that were regulatory shutdowns that basically stopped business. There were supply chain disruptions, there were cost of doing business increases. There could potentially have been discrimination against workers who are older and have disabilities, and because they might be more susceptible to getting sick from COVID. And then sort of the trickle down effect of the fall in consumer demand in many markets onto other markets, and then a reduction in employment as a result. Now, one also could potentially see reduced disability and retirement claiming. And the reason for that kind of comes mostly from thinking about the supply and demand for the programs themselves. So on the demand side, as we've talked about, the expanded UI benefits really make it much easier to be unemployed these days, less of an incentive to try to opt into disability or retirement. There also, as was mentioned earlier, there's been shown to be a wait and see approach, at least among for retirement after recessions like the Great Recession. And some of that is sort of delaying retirement in an effort to recoup losses from unemployment. With the stock market performing the way it was in this during the pandemic, that makes a lot of sense. And then there also could be reduced program demand simply from deaths among disabled and older populations. On the program supply side, there are even more details provided than I had, but this SSA offices closed on March 17th, 2020, shifting to an online application process primarily. And then there were also these limits at the state level on non-essential medical appointments that could have deterred disability applications. So this brings us to our general research questions. How have older workers' employment outcomes evolved over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic? And did the COVID-19 pandemic result in changes in Social Security, disability, and retirement applications? We're going to use data from several different sources. This is going to cover the period from January 2015 to March 2021 to allow us to have a baseline and then look at this past year and how things changed over the past year. We use data from the current population survey, 2.5 million observations, individuals ages 5 to 70, and the outcomes we look at are employed, employed absent, unemployed, not in the labor force, and then the reasons for being not in the labor force include retired, disabled, and other. Now, we also use data from the SSA state agency monthly workload data, which we saw a little bit just a moment ago, and we have 3,825 state months. Those applications come from all ages. We do not have them specific to the older population, and the outcomes we look at are total applications, SSDI, SSI, and concurrent applications per 100,000 persons aged 20 to 64. We also look at retirement applications, and this is our most limited data. We unfortunately have only national level data. So we have 76 months. It includes all ages, but presumably primarily is coming from an older population due to eligibility restrictions. And we look at total offline and online applications per 100,000 persons, and we adjust by 60 to 69 as the group that's most likely to be applying. We also have data on Google Trends, again, state month level data. These are going to be searches by all ages, and our outcomes are going to be logged search intensities for disability and then separately for retirement. And the idea with the Google Trends is to get sort of a leading indicator of where people are going. So it may take a while to apply for disability or retirement, but before you even start applying, you may search for it online. So it's ideally a leading indicator of what's going to be happening a little bit further down the way with disability and retirement applications. Our other two data sets are state openness and telework penetration. We use a couple of different methods. I'm going to be pretty quick on them just for the sake of brevity today. We're looking at event studies where we're literally going to track the 5 months prior to the pandemic, how outcomes were changing, and then look for the year after March 20th. And then the difference in difference regressions, we're going to be a little more basic, I guess, in a sense. We'll just be comparing the levels before March 2020 with the levels of those outcomes after March 2020. In our regressions, we have a variety of control variables. We have month fixed effects in all the regressions. All the regressions except the retirement applications have state fixed effects. Again, we don't have state information for the retirement applications. We include for the CPS a year trend and demographics information. And for the SSA disability applications data and the Google Trends data, we include year fixed effects to try to capture things like that pre-existing decline that we were seeing in those applications. We also conduct heterogeneity analyses, interacting our treatment effect of being post-pandemic with each subgroup. And we do that for demographics, for gender, race, ethnicity, education, lives alone. And we do it for geographic characteristics, for MSAs with above versus below median telework prevalence, and states with above versus below median openness. So To move on to our outcomes, I'm skipping the descriptive data, so I'm very happy to Stephen for having shown those data, so everyone knows sort of where a lot of the data came from. We're going to start off with the CPS employment outcomes, then we'll get into the applications data where we saw from Stephen Goss, and then into the Google Trends data. So starting off, this is just to kind of get an idea of what's going on with the labor market. On the left-hand side is the event study for people reporting being employed in the CPS. We divide it for 50 to 61-year-olds who are more likely to have disability as an option they might opt into versus those 62 to 70 for whom retirement might be more attractive. We have our months on the x-axis there from September through March, and then these are shares of population that we're measuring on the y-axis. So we see there's this huge dip for both groups, more severe for the younger cohort, and then somewhat of a reversion, maybe a bit faster for the older cohort. On the right, we have employed but absent from the workplace, and we see there's an initial spike, but that largely reverts within a couple months. Moving into our other employment outcomes, so we have unemployed. So we have here the probability that someone reports being unemployed, and you can see there is a spike with the pandemic and with the shutdowns and the pandemic, and it's stronger for the younger cohort, mirroring what we saw with employment. For not in the labor force, there is some change. It's not as big as we see with some of the other outcomes, and there's not as much difference between the cohorts in terms of the initial shock, although the effect of on the likelihood of not being in the labor force, it does appear to be more persistent for the younger cohort. I'm going to just show the difference results for these, the distributional breakouts of NILF for the sake of efficiency, and also just so we can easily compare across the different outcomes. So we see that increase in not in the labor force in the post period, the post March 2020 period. We see an increase in retirement, decrease in reporting being disabled, and a decrease in other. For the 62 to 70-year-olds, we see almost the same thing. So generally, there seems to be this distributional shift away from reporting not being in the labor force because of a disability versus not being in the labor force because of retirement or for other reasons. What I've seen so far in the literature, the other reasons is often attributed to someone opting out of the labor force for caregiving purposes. Here we're on the disability applications data. So this is actually the data that's closer to what Stephen presented. And what we have here is the SSDI only results, the SSI only results on the top. And then on the bottom, we have concurrent SSDI and SSI. And again, these are all adjusted for the control variables and the year fixed effects and so forth. So you can see how the raw data transitions after the adjustment from the last presentation to this. And what we see here is even after all that adjustment, we see a decline in SSDI, not a huge one, but somewhat of a decline. For SSI, we see a much bigger decline. And then concurrent is sort of in between those two, suggesting that SSI is getting hit more. For retirement applications, this is our national level data. We see no overall effect in that first column for total applications. We do see changes for online versus offline. There's an increase in the online applications and a decrease in the offline applications. If we break those out into the event studies below, we can see that that spike in online applications is fairly persistent after March 2020. The offline results are similarly persistent in the post period, although we have some problems with our pre-period. There is a strange low level of applications offline in the last months of 2019. And so we do need to look into that a bit more to try to figure out what's going on with that. But not surprisingly, we see the shift towards online. For our search intensity, these support what we've seen so far for the most part. On the left, we have the searches for the search term disability. We see generally a decline starting sort of in May. And then for retirement searches, we also see a decline, although that reverses a bit more. However, the initial decline is larger. So main results summary, briefly, just to sort of gather our heads around this before we move into the heterogeneity results. So we found reduced employment among older workers with a larger effect for the younger cohort than for the older cohort. This difference across the cohorts came from differences in increased unemployment with a larger effect for the younger cohort. We saw similar small increases in NILF for both age groups, decreased NILF due to disability, and increased NILF due to retirement and other. We saw reduced applications for disability, especially SSI, no overall effect on retirement applications, but online applications increased and offline applications decreased. We also saw decreased searches for disability and retirement, relative to other search terms. We did a bunch of heterogeneity analysis. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can because there was a lot that we did. We have the two different cohorts as well. But generally what we're going to see is that the more vulnerable experience worse outcomes, and that's especially true for the younger cohort. So we look at increased unemployment. In the younger cohort, we see stronger effects among women, less educated, other race, and Hispanic, older cohort, other race, and Hispanic. For increased NILF retired, arguably more positive outcome potentially, we see 50 to 61-year-olds only among those who live alone are more likely to retire than other groups. And then in the 62 to 70-year-olds, we see more educated and non-Hispanics along with lives alone are more likely to report being retired. We see decreased NILF due to disability among less educated Black and Hispanic and lives alone in the younger cohort, and among males and less educated in the older cohort. The increased NILF other category is driven in the younger cohort by less educated Black and other race, lives alone, and then in the older cohort by other race. So sort of generally speaking, they're completely consistent across every one of these results. The more vulnerable experienced worse outcomes, and especially that's true for the younger cohort. We did our heterogeneity by geographic areas. So in MSAs with above median telework capability, for all workers prior to the pandemic, we found that older workers were less likely to retire in the younger cohort of older workers, but the oldest cohort was actually more likely to be unemployed. So at this point, we're trying to develop a telework measure that is just for older adults to capture potential issues with the teleworking being all done by a younger population, while the older population is then more likely to be doing manual labor. In more open states, we found that there were smaller decreases in employment overall, smaller increases in NILF other among the younger cohort. We saw no difference between more or less open states in terms of disability applications, and we saw smaller reductions in search intensity for disability and retirement in more open states. And again, we could not do that analysis for the retirement data because we don't have state information. To summarize the results, I'll start off with the ones that sort of followed the hypotheses I had in my mind. Employment decreased among older adults, large shock followed by slow reversion over time. Unemployment increased, there was a larger effect among 50 to 61-year-olds. NILF retired increased, especially among the less vulnerable. NILF other increased, especially among the more vulnerable. And then we get into some of the less intuitive results that sort of require additional explanation. NILF disabled decreased, especially among 50 to 61-year-olds and the more vulnerable. Disability applications decreased overall, especially for SSI. This has been persistent over time. Retirement applications were unaffected, although we might have expected them to increase, but more online and persistent over time. And Google Trends showed decreased searching for disability and retirement, and that was persistent, especially for disability. What are some potential explanations for the less intuitive results? Why did NILF disability applications, Google Trends disability searches decrease? Well, one of the obvious explanations is the expanded UI benefits. Also, the shift to online-only applications could be partially driving that, the deferral of non-essential medical treatment, and then the possibility that telework is more accommodating to those with disabilities. Then we also were wondering, why didn't retirement applications increase? Why did Google Trends retirement searches decrease, especially given increases in NILF retired? Well, the one explanation I have that sort of explains all three of those results is that the less vulnerable may have been accessing non-SSA retirement assets. More generally, though, this lack of a major increase in retirement could be driven by expanded UI benefits, online-only applications, and a wait-and-see approach that's been seen after other regressions, which is further sort of underscored by the stock market performance being so good during this time period. So just, if you'll give me just a couple more minutes to cover the last few points. We do have some next steps. So we want to better assess and evaluate potential mechanisms distinguishing the supply from the demand side effects in the labor markets and the program participation. We have additional heterogeneity analyses, geographic prevalence of essential versus non-essential industries, and then also industries that may be more or less amenable to working from home. We want to look at high and low income. We've already looked at education, but also include income. We want to create a telework measure for older workers only, use finer geographic areas like counties and MSAs, expand our data use to include the Census Pulse Survey questions regarding SSA claiming, and also the CPS March supplement is out for this year, so we can look at the question on work limitations due to disability across the year from March 2020 through March 2021. And I throw this last point out because I'm hoping someone can help us with this. We have a major limitation for the retirement analysis. We have only national level data available. This is preventing any heterogeneity analysis, any state policy analysis, and it's certainly allowing for substantial confounding from state level characteristics. We were able to get the disability applications data at the county level. Very thankful to John Jankowski for helping us with that, but we have not been successful in getting any further with getting more granular national level data for retirement. So if we could get something at the state level, that would really be amazing. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you all very much for listening to these preliminary results. I hope that they help inform the discussion. And please feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions. My email list is right there.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Can I be heard at the moment?
Yes.
Oh, great. You know, you kind of stole my thunder at the end, because what I was going to ask to follow up was, were there limitations in the data that you were able to find, and what other areas of data would you love to be able to have access to?
Well, the national level data, I'm certainly getting something with retirement is, retirement applications, it seems like it would be not just for this research that we're doing, but there would be many researchers who would be interested in that data as well if we could get some state level applications data available. The other restriction we have is for the disability applications, we don't have age. And so we're looking for the entire population, whereas we're really trying to focus our study on the near elderly and elderly populations.
Great. Thank you. This has been incredibly informative, and now I'm going to give our other board members an opportunity to ask you questions.
Excuse me, could I ask a really quick question?
Sure.
Are phone applications included in the offline, or are they included in online?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe that could help explain some of the strange stuff in that graph.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to turn to the portion of the program in which our other board members have opportunities to ask questions. So I would start with Kim Hildred. Kim, are you there?
I am, and actually, I found all of the presentations to be extraordinarily thorough and helpful. So I have no additional questions actually at this time.
Okay, thank you, Kim.
Mhm.
And Jagadish, are you there?
I'm muted, I think. Now I'm not muted. Thank you very much. As Kim said, all the presentations were succinct, to the point, precisely identify what the information and display information in a very easy to digest format. So that's very helpful. Not always the case with presentations like this. One question for Sarah would be, there are non-intuitive declines in applications from vulnerable groups, as you point out, but it seems like you don't have any hooks in the data to identify all the potential explanations that you provide. So in the presentation, you start off by speculating about what the explanations might be. Show us some overall results about application rates decline after March 2020, but then again, do nothing more than speculate about the possible explanations. So it must be that there are no hooks. Is that the case, or are there other ways you could kind of try to tweak out what might be and how the effects might, which ones matter more versus less?
So actually you hit on my first bullet point for my next step slide, is that we need to try to develop empirical tests for these different types of explanation. Now, some things like the extended UI benefits, it's going to be very hard to do much with that until they expire. We may be able to do something with differences in generosity across states, for example. Prior to the pandemic, we're going to try to work in some of that, but that really is sort of the next stage for this. Like, we've got the descriptives down, we've got a huge number of results. Now, what can we actually explain from this? And certain things are starting to fall out. For example, this consistency, there's this shifting online, and yet these more vulnerable populations are being hit more. Hearing that even at the SSA offices, there's staff who have technology issues. I'm sure if you're talking about older people who are potentially applying for disability or retirement, there are issues with getting an online access, for example. And so, but at this point, I would absolutely say that we have a lot more to do in terms of trying to empirically test these outcomes. At this point, it is speculative. And any suggestions you have for ways to test the differences across those potential explanations would be appreciated.
I was intrigued by your one potential explanation, which is falling back on prior savings. There's no information about wealth levels or net worth or any of the surveys that you have?
So we are going to look at high and low income. That's one of our next analyses we're doing, is to differentiate between high and low income. We did look at education, which typically parallels that very closely, and found that low educated individuals were impacted more. And also less likely to be retired in the nominal labor force results.
Okay, thank you.
Before moving to Nancy Altman, I have a question that's come across the question feature. It says, those older than 66 are not eligible for SSDI, and so are, quote, retired by definition. Does that affect the results?
Well, I think we have been sort of trying to deal with that issue by distinguishing between the two cohorts. So we have this younger cohort, 50 to 61. They're really not going to have access to the retirement side, whereas at 62 and up is going to be going into the Social Security retirement side. And so that's the main way we've been distinguishing between the two.
Thank you. Nancy Altman, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was having technical problems, so I apologize. Some early parts of the presentations, and I have a question that really is for everyone, but it's it appears that there may be about 10% of people who've been affected, who've had COVID, who are long haulers, who may have continuous symptoms. And this, of course, may really affect access and the size of the population to be served and so forth. Do you have any, I know this is quite preliminary, they're still trying to figure it all out, but do you have any of preliminary sense about whether that 10% is about right and what implications there might be for service?
I don't know if that was directed at me specifically.
It was, but
I certainly, I hope others can chime in as well, because I'm not really sure. I mean, that's certainly an explanation that we're considering. I think that might be something that, again, is not going to show up until we have sort of a longer panel of data to observe. I do know that I ran across a disability lawyer recently who said that he's been talking to a lot of such people and trying to figure out how to deal with this long haul COVID issue in the disability courts. So it definitely is something that anecdotally is definitely happening. But I'm not sure how to capture that in the data until we have a longer panel.
yeah, and I guess there's a range. People really don't know yet how long it will last and how severe the symptoms will be. So it would assume an ongoing area.
Yeah, same here. We have no data on that, but certainly it's something to be thinking about in terms of potential growth in claims, that this could be a new category of disability that that they haven't encountered before, and that may have its own challenges and affect service delivery down the road.
If you go back, this is Scott Muller, if you go back historically and look at, as an example, chronic fatigue syndrome, it took SSA a long time to come up with a way of adjudicating those claims. So I would expect that it's going to take a long time for them to develop the medical criteria for this COVID, long haul COVID thing.
I want to remind audience members also that if you do have questions, you can put them into the Q&A feature of Zoom here. And one that came across, which is for any of the panelists, it has to do with whether there is any consideration of how SSA is responding to post-entitlement issues, such as return to work and overpayments, et cetera, how that, if that has been studied during this period as well, or there's data to give us information about it. And
I'll just say that I don't have anything for right now, but our ongoing work is looking at different aspects of SSA service delivery as impacted by COVID. And, certainly something like overpayments might be something that is included in that scope. And so we may be looking at that in the future.
And I have one question of my own that I'll just throw out to the field, has to do with the clear effect upon people who are the most vulnerable, particularly the SSI applicant population that needs to be able to use face-to-face services in order to effectuate an application services. And is that in any way contradictory to what we've known in the past? And can it inform how we address application processes in the future? Easy question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't think it's contradictory or anything. I think it's definitely an issue, and it is one that, I hate to sound like a broken record, but our ongoing work will be looking at vulnerable populations and how services vary across those populations. So we are working very hard on that topic. It is a challenging thing to find the data on.
Very good.
If I may, could I ask a question of Steve Goss?
Please do.
Steve, I'm intrigued by your showing that there was a slight uptick in the data for receipts, disability receipts in 2019. And I know you assiduously compare with all data sources your results. Have you compared with the private disability receipts and whether that has the same sort of trend and potentially also an uptick in 2019? Is the pattern similar or is it very different?
Jagadish, that is a great question. And I would share with you, while we have not as yet done that, and we will with the private sector on the 2019 experience, in the prior years prior to that, for the 3 or 4 years, the declines we were seeing, we did check with private long-term disability insurers, and they were seeing a very similar pattern. And they attributed it specifically to changing nature of jobs and the demands on jobs, the proverbial white collar, blue collar shift. And so we were not surprised to hear that they were seeing similar effects. I guess I would just point that in 2019, it's not entirely clear whether that's wholly a matter of just our bottoming out on the longer term trends that we had seen since 2010. Remember, and this is probably a small effect, but there is the consideration of collateral estoppel, which SSA started in 2019, of when people would apply for one disability type benefit, and when they were already receiving another, that we would take them to the DDS and adjudicate that separately, where prior we didn't. So it was a bit of a level shift in 29. That probably explains a little bit of that. More study on that to be determined. The main reason that I really wanted to put in that slide number 4 was to just show the sort of trending down. And if you did not pay wholly attention to what happened between 2019 and 2020, you would see that we have had this longer term trend. So the levels we're at in 2020, in fact, would not be remarkable compared to what the trend was since 2010. But as you point out, Jagadish, for the tick up that we seem to have in the year 2019. One other point I would make too, relative to what Sarah was pointing out for the further analysis that one might do. Sarah, you might want to take a peek back to the Great Recession, where you can see that on the monthly uptick in disability applications, we did not actually see that until well into 2009, even though the economic recession and unemployment rates started up at the very end of 2007. So it was a considerable delay, and our analysis suggests that really was because of the extended unemployment, to a great extent, unemployment compensation. So I think you do have actually a period you can model on from that, even though we're a little bit early in the game, as you pointed out. We're trying to analyze exactly what's happening under the current pandemic recession, which will undoubtedly be different because it's not just an economic recession, but much more.
I'm not seeing additional questions in our Q&A slot. And are there any additional questions from board members?
So I might ask one of Kurda to round out the participants. In your study or your review of what happened, have you considered obviously the COVID-19 was kind of a black swan event, if you admit that terminology. So, and it's not necessarily easy to predict these things, and obviously not easy to predict these things, but also not easy to prepare for contingencies of all kinds. Some shocks is not possible to insure against. But have you considered, have you looked at the contingency planning that SSA does for different eventualities like cyber attacks and natural disasters and so on? And do you have any conclusions to draw from this, lessons to draw from this experience?
We have not done that work yet. However, within GAO, we have other teams and areas that look at cyber issues, look at sort of cross-country COOP planning and planning for disasters and things like that, that are looking at sort of on a cross-government basis how are federal agencies, what are their lessons learned from this experience that could be captured and put into policy for future events. Because we have looked in the past at responses to unexpected things. Like I'm thinking years ago, the IRS's basement was the Treasury building's basement was flooded and all their records were down there, and they weren't prepared for that. They hadn't figured out how to operate, off-site or any of those things. So this is a real opportunity, I think, to study the response and think about how, as a government, we could be more nimble. I think we've learned a lot about what we can do offline, as pretty much everyone else in the world has been learning. That life can go on if you, even when you can't get into the office, if you have the right technology and equipment. So yeah, I think that there's a tremendous amount to be learned there.
There is a question that's come in. I will read it. And this is for anyone who's ready to respond. It says, are non-medical denials included in the data discussed today? Some SSA managers are now requiring that concurrent T216 claims be taken from every applicant, even when non-medical requirements clearly are not met. Does anybody want to respond to the question of whether non-medical denials are included in the data?
Yeah, I don't think we looked at that data as part of our work that we did in November. But I don't know if any of my colleagues, Erin or Chris, had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm pretty sure the monthly workload data are derived from the DDS level, in which case they would have already gone through that non-medical review.
Okay, great.
We focused on applications data, so presumably that wouldn't be part of that.
Bob, I had a quick question.
Please.
Well, I wanted to mention that we do have the technical experts on the phone, so I didn't know if they wanted to speak to that process, as well as the field office managers handling that initial workload. Peggy and David, I know you're dialing in and should be able to speak. Are you there? Sorry for the setup, but I think that, yeah, so I don't think we have any other questions from the audience at this point.
Okay,
I
Kim.
just had a quick question, Bob, for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you know when the next report you were referring to, approximately when you think that might be ready?
Yeah, very, very approximately. Sometime next, probably early in the next year. We are, kind of at the beginning stages right now.
Okay. Okay, great. That's helpful. Thank you.
I have had another question come in. Here it is. What role has the absence of online application options had on the fall off we're seeing regarding SSI applications?
Can you say that again?
the role that, this is a question about the role of the decline in online SSI applications has had on the results reported.
So I think for context, this is the fact that the SSI applications only for a certain portion of people can complete the SSI application online if you meet a set of criteria.
And that may go beyond just counting the numbers, obviously, in terms of interpreting what the cause is of that, but it seems intuitive. Yeah.
When are the offices scheduled to reopen? Has that been set yet?
No, I don't think
It's
so.
appointment only for dire need circumstances. So someone would be able to call the 800 number and be walked through the process to apply. That there's issues with providing documentation and verifying who you are. So there are instances where the SSI payment would be the difference between food, shelter, etc. They're handling those appointments in the office right now, but they're limited by the CDC maximum level of people in the office.
It seems like that might be one of the best ways to see how much of a negative impact going online was, to see what happens when you flip it off, right?
And actually that raises a question that I've been thinking about too. It's a thought, but I'd like to get your reaction to it. And that is, to the extent the theory is correct that the one of the big causes of the fall off in applications is the fact that field offices were not open. Does that mean that in opening the field offices, there should be really a concentration on low-income areas first, on maybe those offices being expanded? I mean, what implications in terms of the transition from going from closed offices to open offices, and then in the future implications about how many field offices, where they should be located, and so forth?
Yeah, one would expect that there'd be some policy questions as you have these conflicting forces of creating greater efficiencies through the use of IT, and then this perhaps clarifying that people who aren't effective in using IT have greater needs, and so there'd be greater need in face-to-face types of services, and so you allocate your resources accordingly.
I mean, I could just see them sort of being flooded potentially with a lot of in-person visits, as soon as things open up, and just being somewhat, potentially overwhelmed by the demand for services. And I don't know that they have a basis on which to prioritize who's, what's coming across the threshold on a given day. So it's just going to be a challenge and something that SSA has to be prepared for.
I do want to make a quick plug for the board's work. Last year in June, we published a report on field office closures. Now, the time we published it, the COVID-19 pandemic had already came about. But we started the research before, when we were looking at the impact of local field office closures. So part of that research that Manasi Deshpande and co-authors used with SSA administrative data was it showed disparate impact on people applying for disability benefits, and discouraged those more likely to apply. So that finding is relatively well known, but one that I think, another finding of that paper that I think is really relevant to this conversation is the mechanisms in which that effect occurred. So they essentially explain almost 50% of the difference, or 30 to 50%, the largest portion was because of the congestion in nearby offices once an office is closed, as opposed to the driving time to get there. So if using wait times as a variable, that had the highest impact on declines in applications. So that would go towards the argument of what would the impact be with really congested offices when they're reopening and everyone's trying to apply for disability. I'll put a link into the paper.
I think I see perhaps another. 5 minutes to go. The questions start pouring in, but How can SSA do more outreach to address the people who fall through the cracks last year? And that may be outside of your wheelhouse for this presentation. So anybody want to take a crack at it? Okay, hearing none.
But that's a question for the next panel, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'll just say that we're getting near conclusion now. I'm from Oregon. I normally do my work in Oregon, but I'm on a road trip right now, and I'm in Kansas City. And so I drove through many places that I normally don't see. And I can tell you that the attitude towards COVID and masking and all that kind of stuff really varies quite a bit in these different places, you see. And I can imagine that many of the factors that we're talking about in terms of how SSA responds to COVID has to also obviously respond to the people we're serving. And there isn't uniformity, shall we say, in terms of the attitude. So obviously the work that's been done in figuring out how SSA has been able to respond to this very, as Steve pointed out, very unusual event, maybe every 100-year event, is really significant for us thinking through how to move forward. And I want to take an opportunity to thank all the panelists and everyone who's participated today in this discussion. And for the good of the order, are there any other comments before we conclude? Well, then, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a 15-minute break now, so if everyone can reconvene at 2:15.
Okay.
All righty. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Thank you for returning to the board's roundtable on Social Security's public service. I have the privilege to moderate this panel and guide us through this 2-hour conversation. Because of its length and diverse range of panelists, I'll share an overview so we're all on the same page. I will be asking each panelist to introduce themselves at the beginning of each section of the discussion, and their full bios may be found on our website. First, we will hear from 3 advocates who will help us. Hold on just a second. So sorry. They're going to help us understand who Social Security's underserved populations are and the challenges they are experiencing. Then we will hear from our 2 OMB representatives who will discuss how the Evidence Act and being named a high impact service provider by OMB impacts SSA. Next, we'll bring in our researchers. Our former researcher will discuss SSA's internal research efforts and data limitations. Then 3 researchers working on SSA-funded projects will share preliminary findings from their work. Finally, all of our panelists will explore together what types of questions SSA should consider for its learning agenda and what data are necessary to answer these questions. And as with the first panel, Kristen, Dama's colleague at Community Legal Services, Jonathan Stein, may also join us for the conversation. So we will begin with our advocates. So what I'd first like to do is start with Kristen and ask her to please introduce herself and tell us about the agency she works for, their mission, and their clientele.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kristen Dama. I am the managing attorney of the SSI practice at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. We are a large legal services organization, one of the largest in the country, and we serve between 10 and 12,000 clients a year, and hundreds of those are SSI recipients who are seeking SSI. We prioritize, we are really lucky in Philadelphia. We have a robust private bar who takes a lot of SSI cases in addition to Social Security disability cases. And so we focus on clients who are not a fit for the private bar model for lots of different reasons, including whether their cases are fee generating. So we prioritize cessations. We also take children's cases. And then for adult claimants who are not cessation cases, but initial applications, we prioritize those cases that just don't really fit anywhere but within the legal services model. So we represent people with really serious behavioral health conditions with a particular focus on trauma disorders, people who are limited English proficient, people who have prior files and are returning from incarceration, refugees, which I think will that group of clients will grow in the coming months, and then other people who have various barriers that make it difficult for them to navigate the SSI system, including people who are unhoused or precariously housed, who for whatever reason aren't a fit for the SOARS system, or maybe are like later on in the SOARS system. Kim, is that all you wanted me to say?
Yep.
Do you want me to say any more right now? Okay.
That's perfect. And obviously we'll be talking more in just a little bit. Okay, next, Kate.
Great, thank you. My name is Kate Lang, and I'm a senior staff attorney with Justice and Aging. We're a national advocacy organization with the mission of improving the lives of low-income older adults. So we are lawyers. We don't provide direct representation like Kristen does, but we are lawyers who use the power of the law to fight senior poverty by securing access to affordable health care, economic security, which includes Social Security and SSI benefits. And we focus on the needs of low-income beneficiaries and populations that have traditionally lacked legal protections, like people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and people with limited English proficiency. So we advocate for strong protections to ensure that people receive the benefits that they're entitled to promptly and without any arbitrary denial or disruption.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kate. And lastly, Bethany.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Bethany Lilly, and I'm the Senior Director of Income Policy at the ARC of the United States. The ARC represents people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their family members, and their service providers. So I have a very kind of bird's eye view of all of the different issues that people with disabilities might encounter throughout the different processes. I think the point that Kristen made and points that other folks made during earlier panels today about this not just being about applications and awards, but about being post-entitlement considerations related to continuing disability reviews, related to overpayments. We've seen a lot of that this year, past year, as the pandemic has kind of been there. And in many ways, I feel like my network has been on the front lines. So I hope that I'll be able to kind of communicate that perspective here.
Great. So we've got a few overarching questions that we'd like to talk about first, and perhaps we could go in the same order, and each of you can respond. So our first question is for you to tell us who, in your view, are the underserved populations at Social Security.
Sure. I mean, I think we see, I think there's a lot of overlap between who SSA talks about as their underserved community and who we see. I mean, we see a particular slice of the SSI and Social Security world, all of whom have barriers. That's why we're involved, as opposed to anyone else. That's why they need lawyers. And so I think some common threads that kind of cut across demographics are the experiences that they're having right now. In the pandemic. And I think one of the ways that we're really thinking about the client communities that we serve is that they're also the people who are most likely to be left behind when the pandemic ends, and most likely to have experienced some pretty significant hardship that goes well beyond, I think, the universal hardship that all Americans have experienced. Our clients are in communities that have been the hardest hit by COVID infections and deaths, and have lost family members and friends at a far higher rate, I think, than the population as a whole. Because of the intersection of high community infection rates and the prevalence of behavioral health conditions in our clients, many of our clients have not felt comfortable leaving the house in a very long time. And it may be some time before they feel comfortable leaving the house, even as field offices begin to open. Many of our clients are in communities that haven't had consistent mail service for at least a year, if not longer. Many of our clients have been completely disconnected from the healthcare system, either because of quality issues and prevalence of telehealth, because maybe they're not comfortable with telehealth or they're not in housing that is stable enough to, or housing circumstances for them to participate in telehealth, especially because of behavioral health conditions. Many of our clients have IEPs, and those IEPs have not been honored, or they have been expired, and schools have not been willing to renew them in the pandemic. So they have no school supports that they've relied on for years. Many of our families have children with disabilities that require really significant parent intervention for virtual schooling. And so parents are disconnected from work, and they are really focusing exclusively on caretaking with no time or space to do SSI paperwork or deal with overpayments or even maybe open what mail gets to them. Many of our clients are only in their homes right now, to the extent that they do have homes, because of moratoriums that are going to end and are going to create massive housing disruption and even more hardship for SSI to find them, or SSA to find them and communicate with them. And all of our clients are used to engaging with Social Security offices exclusively in person, and many just do not have the bandwidth or the resources to figure out how to deal with the phone and the internet resources that exist.
Great. Thank you. That was really thorough. Appreciate that. Kate.
Yes, so thank you, Kristen, for saying all of that. I just wanted to lift up a couple of points, particularly around people with limited English proficiency, that I think that they are particularly isolated in the current environment and having difficulty being connected with the services that they need. And the second point I wanted to make was around the digital divide. I think Kristen alluded to this, but just to be very specific, that in the current environment, there are many individuals, whole communities that are not able to access the internet, who don't have that technology, who don't have the resources to pay on a monthly basis for a significant amount of data or connectivity, and they are really very isolated. And I think there's been a big shift in a lot of people's expectations about how people who do have that digital access are able to accomplish basic tasks, and that there are people without that access who are in danger of being left behind. And the expectation that just because I, Kate Lang, can file paperwork online or use other online services to accomplish basic tasks doesn't mean that there are people who are low income who have that same kind of access.
Great, thank you. And Bethany.
I want to build on Kate's point about lack of access here, because speaking on behalf of the entire disability community, we have, a huge diversity of needs and capacities within the community. And I represent people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And some of my folks will be fine getting on a computer and getting through something. Some of them are going to always need someone to help them out through that process. And I think of the folks who need someone to help them through that process as the most vulnerable. Although I don't particularly like using the word vulnerable to describe people. And I think Kristen described really accurately a lot of the issues that folks with disabilities encounter, kind of no matter what situation they find themselves in, because they face those barriers with kind of understanding paperwork, understanding how to get online if they need to, especially when you have executive functioning challenges that come with a lot of intellectual or developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities. You end up with these barriers that I don't think people are necessarily going to see just looking at someone. They think, oh, they can figure that out. And that is just not the case for a lot of folks who I represent and a lot of other folks with disabilities. And so I think when I think about I think about folks who are going to need that help, who are going to need somebody like Kristen or somebody like a case manager at one of my local ARC chapters to walk them through how this process is going to work.
Great. So I'm hearing that clearly the fact that the field offices are closed is a real problem. Obviously, so many of these folks are looking for, or have in the past relied on, face-to-face services at the field offices. Is there anything Social Security can learn from the three of you in terms of how you're working with your clients during these pandemic times? Are there things that you're doing that you're finding successful that SSA could learn from you? And I'll just open that up to any of you. Any magic solutions that you can share with them?
I'll take a stab and then I'll turn it back over to Kate and Kristen, because I think they might have a little more concrete suggestions. But one thing that comes to mind is we have been trying to be extraordinarily transparent about the information that we have, and sharing it as quickly and as widely as we possibly can. I mean, especially in the early days of the pandemic, there was extensive confusion about absolutely everything, what was getting passed through Congress, what wasn't getting passed. We made it a point, I mean, especially with the stimulus checks and all of the work around getting them automatically out to Social Security beneficiaries and SSI beneficiaries, you know, making sure that that information was available. And I think SSA definitely tries to do that, but on the kind of, I'm thinking around asset limits right now as a concrete example. You know, we are hitting the point where folks who haven't spent down the first economic impact payment or the first stimulus payment might be encountering asset limit issues. There are also going to be folks who just are over the $2,000 and have been for a year because they've gotten the stimulus check and then they've gotten the second one and the third one. And we already have been hearing on the ground about problems with those, with folks who shouldn't be encountering these problems, and how much of that is Social Security communicating from the top about, you know, yes, there have been 3 rounds of stimulus checks. If people are over $2,000, you should be checking on that before you terminate someone's benefits, before you start taking other steps. And I have a lot of sympathy for SSA right now, because everybody has had to have those dramatic workload shifts. But I think when we're in this remaining time of crisis, like, I think we really need to be very transparent and clear and reiterate things as many times as we can to help people think through what exactly is going on.
Great. Kirsten,
I don't know that we have any magic bullets. I think this is just a really hard time to reach people. And I think we are struggling through it and are really excited to open our doors as much as anyone, because I think there is no substitution for in-person service. I think the thing that we have learned during the pandemic is how precarious the system is and how precarious people's connections to the system is. And I think there are 2, I think, big lessons that we've learned that maybe we can take something from. I think one is how much people rely on Social Security offices, not just to solve problems, but to understand problems. Because I think even for people with high levels of literacy who do speak English or Spanish, those notices make no sense to a lot of people. And I think we have an entire safety net that has been built on people being able to take notices and have a security guard read it to them, right? And that is not the greatest way to run a safety net program. And we've been sort of stumbling along, allowing that to be the system until offices shut down. And I think there's no substitute for that. I think the other thing that we learned is that people who do need in-person service are going to use every possible opportunity to get it. And so we know that our case manager and social service friends have been doing this work of reading notices to people and waiting on hold with people and trying to become subject matter experts on overpayments in ways that they never had to do before, with not a lot of recognition or resources, because people are showing up because they don't know where else to go. And our case manager friends and our social service friends are the ones who've been open. And so I think part of this is helping them build tools. I know Social Security started that. I think one of the best ways to build those tools is with money. And then also, I do think there is just no substitution for in-person service, as much as we do want to invest in more accessible virtual services.
Yeah, so I'll just say yes to both of those, you know, in terms of like information being publicly available. You know, I personally feel like there's still a lack of transparency with Social Security about a lot of their policies. I've done a lot of FOIA requests around emergency messages and tried to share those with people. when they're not publicly available on Social Security's website. But, you know, they haven't responded to all my FOIA requests, and there are still many emergency messages that are not publicly available. You know, even now I get questions from advocates about things, and I'm like, I just did 3 webinars about that over the past year, and people still have questions. So I feel like there's going to be this ongoing process as things open up. We can't just be like, you know, 4th of July, pandemic's over, everybody can move forward with a clean slate. There's going to be like 15, 16 months worth of issues that need to be resolved. You know, there's still going to be people with notices from October or November of 2020 who haven't had anybody to help them with that. And just now, you know, in the coming months as the office is reopening, now they're going to be going into the local office and saying, I don't understand this notice, or saying, you know, I applied last year and I never heard anything, or I wasn't able to apply last year and I want to do it now. So I think there's going to be kind of that pent up demand. And Social Security is going to have to plan for that. And also I expect and hope that they will you know, be expansive in their use of good cause policies and other ways they have to you know, be generous to people and recognize what how difficult things have been for people during the pandemic, and, you know, giving people the benefit of the doubt and being as generous as possible with those policies.
Mm-hmm. I know, great points all. I know that Kate, I believe you're serving on the SSI outreach group, and I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about basically how that's going, and maybe more importantly, whether SSA seems to be poised to take this information, and not only in terms of getting people in the door for you know, just applications generally, but how to handle reopening relative to these particular populations who are going to need the most help.
Yeah, so I've been heading up a work group of advocates who have been meeting with Social Security about the SSI application. You know, on the first panel, a couple of the speakers talked about the data showing declines in applications for SSI disability applications, and that is very troubling. But the data they didn't share is about the declines in people applying for SSI based on age, which have been even more significant, more devastating, which says to me that there are thousands of low-income seniors out there who should be receiving SSI who are not. So we are hopeful that, you know, at some point, you know, the agency is working towards having an online SSI application that's available to everybody. Right now, there's a limited group of people applying for SSI concurrently based on disability who can use an online portal, but no application online for people applying based on age. So we see the agency moving towards that, developing that. You know, so we continue to work with them. Obviously, that's an extensive process because we don't want to just put the application online. We want to improve the application, to take this opportunity to improve it before the online application is expanded. So that's a process. You know, and you know, we're grateful to be involved with that process and be part of giving feedback as the agency develops that, and we understand it'll take some time. So I think in the interim, you know, we're just looking for whatever steps the agency can take to help people connect with benefits. Right now, the barriers that are in place are preventing people from accessing benefits that they're eligible for. So what are the steps we can take in the interim to reduce those barriers? And recognizing that, you know, I think as Bethany has made the point, even when there are applications online available for people, there are just certain people that's not going to work for. You know, because of the digital divide, because of people's cognitive impairments, other difficulties they may have interacting with an online form, again, limited English proficiency, there are always going to be people who need in-person assistance with applying for SSI.
Mm-hmm. Great. Kristen or Bethany, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I'll just add briefly that to Kate's point about the application needing to be simplified in addition to other things, for an agency that is like a purpose of the agency is to work with my clientele, to work with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. That application makes absolutely no sense to somebody who has an intellectual disability. It's not in plain language. It's not decipherable. There are not plain language versions that people can look at. You know, it's something that needs to be desperately updated, but we need to think about the population that we're working with. And that goes, I saw something in the Q&A, I think, around notices as well. I mean, to Kristen's point, people just show up at the field office with the notice. They're like, I don't have any idea what this means. Can you please help me? And that's what a lot of my folks are getting with these economic impact payment asset overreaches or overpayments, is coming in and just being like, they terminated my benefits, but I just got a stimulus check and that wasn't supposed to count. Or maybe they don't even know that it wasn't supposed to count. In fact, I guess most of the time they won't, but the field office staff should know that. And I think that's, you know, we rely, to Kristen's point, I think she really described it well in terms of SSA. We've been functioning with the system where you can just go into the field office and get help. And the pandemic has really highlighted that that's not enough. I'll also add that we need more people like Kristen to help folks through that process as we get this rush of cases as it comes. I think that's going to be one of the most, I mean, the earlier panel talked about this. We've all talked about this. Like, we are going to not only have the COVID long haulers starting to interact with the system, but we're also going to have all these people who put off things that they needed to put off because they wanted to be safe during the pandemic. And that rush means that, I mean, it can't just be SSA responding, it also has to be the advocacy community. And I know we're thinking a lot about that. And I'd like SSA to be thinking about that too.
Great, great. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you for joining us. And we have been talking about basically who are SSA's underserved population. We've been talking about the ways that those who are underserved interact with the agency, obviously with the focus on in-person would be preferred, which is mostly not possible, and have been talking about the challenges they are experiencing and some recommendations for change going forward. So with that, I welcome any comments or anything you'd like to add to the discussion. And I think you're on mute.
You're mute. I've come on a little late in part because I was at a meeting with SSA people on presumptive disability, which is sort of another area of accessing benefits and how underutilized presumptive disability is. I think we just, you know, simplification is both a process and application, but it's also a substantive eligibility policy one, where I think there's got to be handles and flags like homelessness with serious mental illness that should, you know, be the flag that gets someone benefits quickly. And right now, there are very few proxies except very detailed medical documentation or diagnoses that, you know, provide that more simplified eligibility process. And I think presumptive disability as a whole policy has been dying on the vine at SSA for almost a decade. But I think we have to think kind of creatively and a little out of the box about, you know, what is a medically determinable impairment, to find, you know, proxies like being in a hospice, like being homeless with a serious mental disorder, that should quicken access to benefits. And I think Social Security's whole history about how and who they give benefits to really has mired them into requiring umpteen documentation that has delayed the process and denied benefits to great numbers of people who can only get them if they have a lawyer and then can wait a year or 2 or 3 on appeal, you know, to, you know, establish the mountain of evidence that's needed. So, so I think the turnaround needs to be in a number of areas.
Sure thing, sure thing. Great. Let me just first open things up to our board members. We've got a great group of folks here. Do board members have any questions?
I have a, Nancy, I have a question for all of you really, and that is, you've mentioned the issue of overpayments. I know there was a suspension of overpayments, now they've started again. And I've heard anecdotally some of you were talking about the impact of, I guess it was Senator Menendez raised it at the Finance Committee about both emergency unemployment benefits as well as the relief payments. So what has your experience been? What advice, what do you think the right policy should be? There is going to be this, that we're still in the middle of, we like to think we're out of the pandemic, but you look around the world, we're obviously not.
I can get started with that. So in terms of, the overpayments, particularly around economic impact payments, our recommendation is that there be a little reverse data exchange between Treasury and SSA, where now, Social Security shared information, data about Social Security and SSI recipients in order to facilitate them getting the payments. We would like to see Treasury send some data back to the Social Security about the dates and amounts that they made those payments to people, so that Social Security can just look at that data and say, oh, this person is over the resource limit in terms of the money in their bank account, but we know that it has not been more than 12 months since Treasury sent them that economic impact payment. So we're not going to send them a suspension notice. We're not going to send them an overpayment notice because we have that data. We're not going to put the burden on the recipient to appeal our determination or dispute that determination and have to prove that it's the economic impact payment to us. The burden should be on the agencies to talk to each other to straighten that out, so that the recipients, that we just think there are going to be too many people who fall through the cracks if the burden is on them to prove that this is the economic impact payment and they're not actually over the resource limit.
I want to go a little bit broader than that, and this is something that relates to the commentary from Senator Menendez at that hearing, which I think really highlighted a couple of different ways that this works. You have the unemployment insurance benefits that if you were working part-time on SSI, before the pandemic, you were likely not eligible for unemployment anywhere practically anywhere in the United States. Most states don't have particularly generous unemployment programs. So with the change that came with the disaster unemployment, folks suddenly started to get suspension notices, which, I represent a lot of young folks who are just starting out in the workforce. They're on SSI. They're trying to figure out what their work capacity is. And this is definitely going to discourage them from trying that again, because they are suddenly getting hit with all of this overpayment. In New Jersey, some folks got Medicaid suspension notices, which is terrifying if you are a family member or a person with a disability, to find out that your healthcare might get canceled. And what I would actually argue is this is the same situation as the EIPs. It's the same situation as a lot of the overpayments we saw earlier in the pandemic, where SSA effectively just wasn't taking paperwork because they hadn't figured out how to do it. And so folks ended up with overpayments despite having tried to submit paperwork or having submitted paperwork and it getting lost. Where SSA, to Kate's point, needs to just kind of deal with this. And what Congress proposed, Chairman Larson and Chairman Davis had a bill that would have automatically waived all those overpayments. Given they were caused by the agency, I don't know why beneficiaries should have to do anything. I don't think they should. And, as Senator Menendez said, Congress did not intend to kick people off of their benefits when they passed pandemic relief. And I would actually argue under the Disaster Relief Act that both the EIPs and the unemployment benefits can be read as simply disaster relief rather than anything else. And SSA, if the General Counsel's office could come to the same view of the legal situation that I have, could issue some guidance on that I think would really help beneficiaries right now who are struggling through this process and just getting stuck in the cracks, as Kate said.
Oh, sorry, we can move on.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Kristen. Go ahead.
I don't have any more like policy analysis to add. I think Bethany and Kate said it perfectly. I think just the broader point that I wanted to make goes back to something I said earlier, which is that I think we have an entire system that is set up with the assumption that we can send people notices, they will understand those notices, and then if Social Security made a mistake, we can go to Social Security, we can tell them they made a mistake, and then it will get fixed. And that just is not happening. It has not, it wasn't happening great before the pandemic. It has not been happening at all during the pandemic. And it's probably not going to happen for a while after the pandemic because of work, because of workload backlogs, because of people who have not dealt with their paperwork or haven't even gotten paperwork in a year. And so I think there's an issue not just with addressing individual policies like the administrative waivers of overpayments or like the EIP terminations, but in really rethinking what it means to have an accessible program for people who are eligible and really committing to recalculating how we're placing burdens on the people who just simply cannot meet them right now.
Great point. Great point. We've got a lot of questions lined up and I got to move on, but we'll have more Q&A time at the end. So you're a popular group here. People want to pick your brains. All righty. So next I want to move on to some of the research issues that we have. So, or actually, I think I'm losing myself here. Just one quick second. Here we go. OMB. We are moving on to OMB. So I wanted to first ask our two representatives from OMB to introduce themselves. So starting with Amira, can you go ahead?
Sure. Hi. And thanks, Kate, Kristen, Bethany, and Jonathan. That was really interesting. And I appreciate all that you do. And thank you for sharing that. My name is Amira Boland. I work at the Office of Management and Budget. I'm the Federal Customer Experience Lead, which the idea behind that is that we have folks at OMB that are focused on thinking about the federal government through the lens of the people that navigate it and not just through agency silos and the bureaucracy that we've created and typically manage things. And I'm also working with Erica, my colleague, who I will turn it to next, on coordinating the OMB's piece of the implementation of Executive Order 13985, which is on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities.
Great. Okay, Erica.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to all of you for having me today. My name is Erica Zalewski, and I am a Senior Evidence Analyst on the OMB Evidence Team. We are a small but mighty team in OMB's Economic Policy Division, and our charge is rather large. We are charged with making sure that the government builds and uses evidence in its decision-making. In addition to doing cross-agency, cross-OMB work on things like the Equity EO, as Amira mentioned, we are also primarily responsible for implementing the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, or the Evidence Act for short. My team in particular is charged with implementing the requirements of Title I, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. I also cover SSA for our team, and I'm very happy to be here kind of talking through these issues with you all.
Great. Alrighty, so we have a couple of more overarching questions that we'd like both of you to address, or feel free to hand it off, you decide. But the first question is, what does the Evidence Act mean for SSA? And tell us exactly, what is a learning agenda?
All right, that's a great question. Well, I never assume that everyone lives and breathes the Evidence Act like I do. So I hope you will all indulge me for what I'm going to call the 20-second speed overview. So basically, the Evidence Act was signed into law of January 2019, and it really builds on the work of the Bipartisan Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which came out with a series of recommendations in September of 2017. And the Evidence Act is considered a down payment on those recommendations, and it addresses 11 of the Commission's 22 recommendations. It has 3 titles. The first title focuses on evidence building activities, and that's kind of the focus of my work, and I think what we'll be talking about with the learning agenda. But I do want to mention that there are 2 other titles that you've probably heard floating around, including the Open Government Data Act, it's mixing up in my mind this afternoon, as well as a 3rd title that focuses on statistical programs and confidential information in that space. So in Title I, there are what we call the kind of big three deliverables, the learning agenda, an annual evaluation plan, and the capacity assessment. I also want to point out that Title I only applies to CFO Act agencies, so SSA is included there. And it requires them to designate an evaluation officer as well as a statistical official. So that was the 20-second version. There's obviously a lot more and I could talk all day, but I do want to just spend a minute kind of saying why I think we should all care about the Evidence Act. You know, first, it really calls on agencies to significantly rethink how we currently plan and organize evidence building, data management, and data access functions to make sure that we're doing it in an integrated and strategic way. We at OMB are really excited about the Evidence Act and the opportunity that it provides all of us to improve how we do business and how we improve on our mission. It really calls on us to kind of break down those silos. And we do this at OMB. Our implementation team includes folks from all across the agency. So we think this is a really great opportunity if we leverage it. So what does that mean for SSA and how does that get back to the learning agenda? So, you know, SSA is covered by Title I. I see some of my colleagues from SSA's evaluation office here on the line. So I know that they know that. You know, they are required to do some of these documents or to do all the documents like the learning agenda, capacity assessment, and annual evaluation plan. So what is a learning agenda? This term gets thrown around a lot, but at its heart, it's really a strategic evidence building plan. In it, agencies need to articulate what we call priority questions that, when answered, will allow the agency to more effectively and efficiently meet its mission. These questions may be operational about how the agency kind of does its business. They may be mission strategic about, you know, the outcomes that you're having on clients or participants. At the same time, the learning agenda should include both short-term questions and longer-term questions. And in that learning agenda, the agencies really set out the priority questions and kind of lay out how they plan to build evidence to address those questions, including the types of studies, projects, so on and so forth. These documents are iterative, they are flexible, and really should be tailored to meet the agency's needs. At OMB, we've taken great care not to be overly prescriptive and really want the agencies to use these documents as their sort of foundational strategic evidence building plan. So I think I will pause there and turn it back to you.
Okay. All right, very good. What does being named a high impact service provider by OMB mean for SSA?
Sure. So to Erica's point, I know that not everybody on this call lives and breathes OMB Circular A11 Part 6, but that is a literal 1,000-page document on how to run a government. And in there is a section 280 that was the government's first ever guidance on managing customer experience and improving service delivery. And so that was really exciting when that got added in 2018, because it really was the first time that we had acknowledged that customer experience and you know, this term of improving service delivery and thinking about ourselves as a service delivery organization, you know, was sort of articulated and defined. And so through that, we knew that, you know, we couldn't just improve all federal services at once. And so we chose to select a number 25 that, you know, due to their volume, the dollar spend of the program, or just the impact that the nature of that service has in an individual's life, we would select those first as a place to start and to hold accountable for the different requirements that we have outlined in that guidance. And so, you know, ranging from SSA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development that have really leaned in and thought of themselves as a high impact service provider at the organizational level, to the Bureau of Trust Fund Administration, which is obviously much smaller, but because of the nature of that program, you know, I think they have just about 250,000 customers in the United States, but still the nature of that program is very important as, you know, folks are able to manage their accounts through that program. So wide range and diversity of programs, but for SSA, what that means, and to their credit, they've been very forward leaning and thinking about themselves as managing customer experience at the enterprise level. OMB A11 Circular Circular A11 requires high impact service providers to do primarily 3 things. The first is that each year they complete a capacity assessment that actually outlines a maturity model in service delivery and customer experience, and looking at how, in particular, looking at what leading organizations in the private sector are even doing around managing experience and service delivery. They're also required to collect customer feedback, which is something that agencies do, in different ways, some consistently, some inconsistently. And so this is meant to create public transparency around feedback that agencies are getting from the people that they serve. And then from what they learn from those 2 activities is to identify at least 2 concrete actions that they will do to improve pain points in their customer journeys. And so those are the types of activities that SSA has been doing. And I think the thing that we're, looking to update in this year's guidance around is how really pushing agencies to think through managing at the service level. So if you think about like the old age benefits application or Social Security card replacement or SSDI recertification, or the process by which you notify SSA in the event of a spousal death and are looking to claim survivor benefits, like actually managing the performance of those services, measuring the burden that those things take to complete and meet your need, looking at the experience measures associated with that is where we're looking at going next.
Great. I appreciate the fact that you are a mighty team. And I'm wondering, how are you thinking about working with agencies to ensure that they get it? If I can maybe use that statement more broadly. I've been around a long time. SSA is very good at responding to OMB, areas of interest, shall we say. But let's be honest, administration changed, the agency personnel doesn't in many respects. And I know that the board has talked a great deal about the Evidence Act. We're big believers. We think it's terrific. But how are you thinking about really making sure that these agencies, because we're really looking at a culture change, right? I mean, how are you thinking about making sure that they get it and they really incorporate this into their culture?
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that you guys are believers. I always love coming to a friendly audience. You're exactly right. It is culture change, right? And, the grandest learning agenda in the world means nothing if we actually don't do the things that we say we're going to do. So I would acknowledge that our colleagues in SSA are dedicated and have really dug in, and I think have been great collaborators on these deliverables to date. And I want to acknowledge their work. This is a priority of this administration. I know there's a lot of EOs and memorandums flying out there, but in January, a memorandum on restoring trust in government through scientific integrity and evidence-based policy making came out. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to read it. Part of that actually directs OMB to issue new guidance on learning agendas and annual evaluation plans. Again, sort of making that connection on the importance of using data and evidence to make decisions. So how do we ensure that people get it? Personally, I try to show them the value and what's in it for them. I think we all come into public service wanting to do better, to meet our mission, to ensure that what we're providing does the very best it can for our families, children, veterans, service members, you name it. And so we believe that the learning agenda is a really critical tool to help you get there. I don't think anyone sits and says, I'm cool with just status quo. We really want to be doing better. And I think we've also taken a learning and improvement framework. There is a long history of evaluation being viewed as a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It either worked or it didn't, and we kind of move on. And I think that framework can be harmful sometimes, and that we really need to be using evidence as an opportunity to learn and to bring that information that we learn back into it. And that's why I love the learning agenda. It really is that cycle. I would point out, I didn't mention this, that it is part of the agency's strategic plan. We are going to the strategic planning working group meetings and actually trying to bring those communities together, the strategic planning folks, the evidence folks, and really have these things swimming in alignment. And they all really need to be going in the same direction. But ultimately, I can't make any agency see the value in this, but we're trying very hard, and we have an administration that is very committed to helping us push this. and we are very heartened by the progress we've seen to date.
Great, that's very good news. One last question before we move on. It's been said that race and ethnicity data are not essential to program administration. So in your view, obviously at that time, this is back in 1999, I've got a quote, how should SSA examine equitable access to programs and services?
It's an incredibly hard, oh, go ahead, Erica, sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I'm gonna let Amira start that one.
No, I know this is a really hard question that every agency is asking right now, right? In particular, because EO 13985 has charged agencies with conducting an equity assessment, and also created the equity data working group. And so obviously learning demographic information about participants is important. And, I think there's lots of questions that agencies have asked around, do we even have this data? Are we allowed to ask these questions? We ask, demographic questions on our forms, but, they're optional and we don't have a high response rate on them. And so there's obviously a lot to think about here as forms and services are designed, and making sure that you have this balance and fit for use. And so thinking through pre-testing forms, and understanding trade-offs of like asking questions and whether or not that might deter people from even applying or sharing other information that's really important, are all things that agencies are wrestling with right now. And so I think one of the places that we are also trying to encourage agencies to look is that you need good data to do good assessment and evaluation work, but there is also other ways of learning about your programs, right? There's a lot you can do with qualitative research and actually understanding how individuals are navigating your programs that can help you improve the design. And so last summer, we actually did an activity where thinking through the lens of not just like a service, but more through the lens of an experience, we looked at a family with a child with an intellectual disability that was sort of transitioning, graduating from high school, losing a lot of those, support structures that they're used to receiving through the school system, and then having to transition to young adulthood and what that looks like. And that was actually a project that we had 7 different agencies work with us, because there's obviously, when you think about it through the lens of an experience that an actual family is navigating, you realize that there's not, the Medicaid part and the, Department of Education, county school system part, and the SSA part, and the, in some cases, housing and urban development. Like, they're experiencing it as a life event, and they don't care who delivers what and who's responsible for what. They need the system to work, and they need it to be understandable. And I think that was actually uncomfortable for a lot of agencies to be working on that project together, to see, lines of responsibility are not always clear. And those gaps at the seams of programs are often where we're failing the American public, right? And so I think between not only multiple federal agencies, but multiple levels of government. And so I think actually doing that process, to your point about culture change, and feeling like it was okay to step outside your lane and learn about something that wasn't, immediately something you had control of, but understanding how it related to your part of the process was a really good exercise. And we even had, SSA employees that were meeting colleagues at HUD or education that work in serve the same customer group, but are, had never met each other before. And so I think doing activities like that are going to be really helpful, and also help us to understand where there's opportunities to improve equitable access, and even just adopting the lens of different characteristics of individuals that would impact how they would navigate a service. My classic example with SSA is like, pretend you're a single mom in West Virginia. I know that there are a lot of reasons outside of your control as to why someone cannot get a Social Security card replacement online in West Virginia. However, when you go to the website, it can end up being like a dead end, because it's not clear what the next step you're supposed to take is. And even just doing that thought experiment that takes 20 minutes can help you then look at like, okay, how do we need to update our website so that it's not a dead end when someone is coming to us? So lots of complexities around demographic data and doing those types of assessments, but lots of things that you can also do in 20 minutes that will help you better update and, you know, get some small wins at least for the equity in your program and service design.
Great, great. Thank you so much. We'll be coming back to you with other questions, but I wanted to move on to our next presenter. So next we're going to be moving into the research area. And I'd like to start with a former agency researcher. So Scott, can you introduce yourself and tell us about your former research portfolio?
Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Muller. I was an economist with the Social Security Administration, the Office of Research and Statistics for 36 years. I've been retired for about 7. Most of my work was in the disability area, although I did other work too. I guess that's pretty much it. I'm coming via internet by the satellite here, which is just barely one step up from dial-up. So anyway, so if I have problems, I'll have to turn off my picture.
Okay.
I'm not an expert in field office workload data, but I certainly can help somewhat with other kinds of data issues and some of the research questions.
Great, great. So speaking to that, can you tell us, based on your experience, how are the voices of those served integrated into agency research efforts?
Yeah, I can't think of too many studies that were looking at this kind of outreach kind of stuff, not within the Office of Research and Statistics. I had a couple of thoughts. Can I go through a couple of thoughts before we talk about that?
Yep.
One of the things is I think it would be really useful for us to make a distinction between the underserved, as it was defined in the presidential executive order, and hard to serve, which is, gets into the internet access, phone access, distance to field offices. I guess you might throw some other things in there like language, but it's just as some background. There's 4% of the people in this country still don't have a telephone, and that's actually increased over the last several years, despite the federal program to do free or low cost phones. Internet's increased a lot. I did some internet work 12 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't know, whatever. And I looked up the new numbers. Currently 10% have no internet. But if you go to the age 65 and over, it's 27%. So there's a huge hard to serve by the online thing. Field offices, as Steve mentioned, changes in the we not only have more workload, we've got fewer offices, less staffing, more claims, and more other workloads. And since in the last 20 years, 99 field offices have been closed, and that's about 8% of the field offices. 1/3 of the resident stations. Now, resident stations are specialty outreach stations where in remote areas. 1/3 of them have been closed. We went from 51 of those down to 35. And field office staffing in work years, now that includes overtime, part-time people and everything. It's not FTEs, it's actual work years. That's the lowest it's been last year. In 2020 was the lowest it's been in 25 years. So we're working, with more workload, less resources. There's still a significant number of people that we can't contact by these other methods. So I just wanted to do that background. And like I said, there's a huge overlap between the underserved and the hard to serve, but they're distinct and the solutions may be different.
A question for you, how feasible would it be for SSA to release de-identified person level data by socio-demographic and geographic characteristics?
We don't have, obviously we don't have race for everybody. Who would it be released to?
Maybe researchers, the public.
I mean,
if it's de-identified.
There's some people. Yeah, there's some people from the DRI and the retirement research consortium that are here. They could probably answer that question better than I could, but we certainly have done that in the past. sometimes we have to do some masking, but and we have a whole group of people up, or we did, and when I left, that were handling those kinds of data requests.
Okay. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move on, but we're going to get into some other questions where we'll love your feedback, Scott. Next, we've got some folks who are doing some current research. And so what I'd like them to do is, again, introduce themselves, tell us about their title, their organization, and their current research that they're doing, and share with us any preliminary findings that they may have. So what I'd like to do is start with Jody.
Sure. Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me today. I am a principal researcher at Mathematica, which is a nonpartisan research organization. I'm also the deputy director of our Center for Studying Disability Policy, which aims to provide rigorous research and findings to policymakers and other stakeholders. As was mentioned, I am part of SSA's Retirement and Disability Research Consortium, and I'm currently involved in a line of work that is looking at geographic variation in beneficiary program flows. We're using SSA's disability analysis file. For what we're doing, we've linked it to the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. I typically don't start with limitations of my work, but I want to talk a little bit first about what we've done and where I think it can be expanded to answer some of the questions that have been brought up earlier. We've looked at data through 2018 to look at new awards to DI and SSI, and also to look at beneficiary work activity, people who are suspended or terminated because they earn above SGA for a sustained period of time. So obviously it's maybe not as real time as some of the presentations we heard earlier on the COVID panel, although I think it's certainly possible that that could be added. Data obviously continues to come in. It wouldn't be in the DAS that I use for my work, but it certainly is something that could be used. You could look at pre or post trends before and after COVID. You could also look at some of the geographic patterns that we've identified to see what occurs as field offices reopen. Nancy Altman had a question about that earlier. I also think it would be pretty straightforward, although we haven't done it yet, to look at some of the underserved, or as Scott just said, the hard to serve populations. Just people looking at distance to field offices, broadband access, homelessness, non-native English speakers, places where COVID was more prevalent, where we may find more long haul cases going forward. There are also a number of outcomes that we haven't looked at that obviously is in SSA's data, looking at denied applicants, appeals, earnings trajectories, overpayments, work CDRs, age 18 redetermination. So I think I wanted to start out by pointing out that while our work has been narrowly focused, I think there are a lot of ways to expand it. So really what we've been focused on is trying to look at geographic variation in disability experiences and program participation. We're building on a growing body of work that has looked at this. And in particular, we looked at census public use microdata areas, and those are for short PUMAs. There are about 2,300 PUMAs in the country. And Kim, related to the question you just asked Scott about data access, one of the reasons that we used PUMAs is that it allowed us to get data at a sufficiently high level of aggregation that we didn't have to worry about some of the data masking that comes up if you're looking at a smaller level of geography. By looking at PUMAs, we have sub-state variation that we're able to look at. Obviously, 2,300 is a lot more than 50, but we don't have quite the level of county data that other researchers have looked at. Just as one point, my colleagues at Mathematica have developed a series of county level maps that look at DI and SSI receipt rates that I think are really nice to get a sense of the sub-state geographic variation. What we found mirrors some of the county level work. We've found that new awards are highest in places like West Virginia and Kentucky, parts of the South, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and then some parts of Eastern New Mexico. This is pretty consistent with beneficiary prevalence, which isn't surprising. We're just looking at flows onto the program, but you would imagine that flows onto the program generally mirror pretty closely the beneficiaries we see. It also is fairly well correlated with disability prevalence. If you look at local level variance in the share of people who report having a disability using national survey data, you see that it pretty well aligns with what we see in award rates, but not entirely. And there are reasons to think that there may be a lot of variation. You know, health behaviors, the availability of jobs certainly contribute at a local level within the state level for what you might see for award rates. We also looked at employment and benefit suspense and termination for work. Interestingly, those patterns are really different than what we see for people going on the program. I think we're the first ones who have looked at that because the DAS has really great information about that. We've seen that places in Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Eastern Dakotas have, and actually the patterns are similar for DI and SSI. Those are places where employment rates are the highest among beneficiaries. And so it really raises the question, what is it that is happening in those local areas that's being supportive of people returning to work? And then we're also doing some more work now that's looking at the share of awards that are in particular impairment groups that are of interest to SSA, musculoskeletal conditions, mental health conditions. It's building on work that my collaborator, John Schwabish, has done looking at beneficiaries. So it's pretty preliminary, so I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but John's earlier work and what we're seeing now is that there's a very high concentration of mental health awards in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Western Massachusetts. So they're really interesting geographic patterns that aren't just at the state level, that are really important to understand, that may signal places that SSA may want to drill down a little bit more. I think obviously there's a lot you can do with these kinds of data, but there are a lot more things that you would need to do looking at really what's going on in particular places. But these maps offer a really nice way to sort of get a big picture of the country and look at pockets where it may be important to dig in a little bit deeper.
Great. Love the maps. Very cool. Okay, next, Purvi.
Hi, thank you. I'm Purvi Savak, also at Mathematica with Jody, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'll start by saying I've been fortunate to have SSA support from my research from basically the start of my career in graduate school. So I have been affiliated with SSA's research consortia, both on disability and retirement behavior, on retirement and disability for many years. And I'm currently a principal researcher at Mathematica. So Kim, you asked us to talk about preliminary findings from our research, and I'll start by saying I'm not currently working on any RDRC funded projects. I'll share some recent findings, and then I'll take a minute to talk about some work I'm doing that's funded through NIDLR, through another agency that might be of interest since we're speaking about vulnerable populations. So in my work for the RDRC, the DRC, the RRCs, I've used a mix of population level national survey data, SSA administrative data, and SSA beneficiary survey data, each offering different strengths because some provide more detail, some provide greater samples, and some provide information on populations that might be at risk for applying for disability benefits but aren't current beneficiaries. So I'll highlight three findings from relatively recent studies that were pre-pandemic, but I think their findings are nevertheless relevant. So first, there's several surveys that show evidence of the growing importance of gig work for young adults, young workers with disabilities. And these jobs can present new opportunities for people with disabilities to work, often with part-time or flexible hours, but they can also present challenges such as unpredictable hours, volatile income, and that might be particular barriers for some people with disabilities. And as we think about workers emerging from this pandemic trying to find work, we have to think about the reality of what the labor market looks like, especially for those individuals who might have lower levels of income facing these kinds of jobs. The second finding I'll share is that the share of disability beneficiaries that want to work has increased over the past decade, while at the same time, fewer beneficiaries are in the labor force. So while work interest can't be measured in SSA administrative data, we can see if people are working, but we can't see their interest in wanting to work. SSA's National Beneficiary Survey regularly surveys a sample of beneficiaries to get important beneficiary perspectives that can't be gleaned from administrative data. And so that sort of information that can be gathered from administrative data, from beneficiary surveys, might be particularly useful in understanding barriers in the aftermath of the pandemic as well. And the third finding I'll share is that even in pre-pandemic times, there was growing evidence from national surveys, national health surveys, that the level of social isolation among people with disabilities has increased over the past 20 years. And that's certainly an area of concern, particularly for underserved or vulnerable populations, especially after a year of pandemic living. So those are three findings from SSA funded research. I want to briefly mention a study that I'm doing funded through NIDLR, focusing on out of school, out of work, young adults, youth and young adults from minority backgrounds. And in thinking about vulnerable populations, I want to just raise this population as one that is particularly often underserved and facing barriers that are not just their disability, but additional barriers that others on the panel have spoken about, whether it's related to racial discrimination or poverty, gender, incarceration, homelessness, multi-generational poverty. And in the work that I've been doing on this project with Centers for Independent Living in particular, I've learned a lot about the work that they do and would encourage SSA to consider, thinking about learning more about these populations, not just by studying SSA beneficiaries, but also perhaps those individuals who are not fortunate enough to yet receive benefits from SSA.
Great, great. Okay, very good. Nancy. You're on mute, Nancy.
Hello.
Good job.
Thanks for the reminder. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Nancy Wong, professor of consumer science from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and partner of the Center for Financial Security and RDRC research site. I am grateful with the support that we have received, I think, from SSA with the RCRC Research Consortium. And so I'd like to share something that is a little bit different from, I think, what has been presented thus far. And it's about our project for the last 2 years and which is still ongoing. So I'd like to share a little bit of it from last year and this year's report as well. It's basically using online SSDI conversations to improve SSA communication and outreach. The motivation for this research is to think about the potential of user-generated content from online forums between SSDI applicants, beneficiaries, and related parties such as legal counsels in order to identify the major areas of confusion about SSA rules and decision criteria, in an effort to evaluate the impact of how and when these customers obtain such information that impact their subsequent interpretation of this information. So the basis of this research is we selected 7 online forums that has SSDI related conversations, ranging from small forums that contains about 300 unique users to over 3,500 unique users, such as Federal Soup, and with a total of about 150,000 posts and 15,000 unique users. And the data span years covering 2004 to 2020 of posts and replies on these online forums related to SSDI applications. And using unsupervised machine learning algorithms, we derive topics which are clusters of words that summarize content on these posts based on the term frequency and their relevance. And in order to delve further into these discussion topics, we use these topics as seed words in the text analysis software called encoder. And these resulting codes can then be used to analyze the efficacy of existing policy to provide policy recommendations. At least we hope to be able to, shed some light in that directions. So we use a particular program called Epistemic Network Analysis, or ENA, to help us identify and quantify these connections among elements in the coded data and represent them in a dynamic network model. And these models would allow us to model the organized knowledge in SSDI online forums and to capture the relationships among these topics by quantifying their core currency within these discussion threads. And the lessons that we learn is that, as everyone is already aware of, there are significant confusion with respect to the application, the appeal, and the review process. And we're currently working on different areas of confusions, and I'll just like to share one of them as an example here. For example, we look at how comparing the kind of information that are shared between initial applications and the appeals process. And it shows that the information shared by these forum users and the topic connections are different between those conversations relating to the application process versus the appeal process. And there are areas of confusion or sources of struggle during these processes. And we also found significant differences that are in the conversations between filing these initial application and discussing about the denials and appeals. And it reveals potential gap in the knowledge between applicants who are denied and how the SSA is evaluating these claims based on their discussions. So more specifically, denied applicants are struggling to adequately document their underlying medical conditions. And for example, in particular, pain and mental health would be more difficult for them to document, and they are probably the dominant group of ailments that are occupying the denials and review process conversations because they are difficult to justify due to a lack of physical diagnosis. And in contrast, conversations of initial application display stronger connections with neurological conditions, which are easier to document if they possess a physically identifiable source. So this potentially demonstrates the applicant's lack of awareness in how to link their medical conditions to their inability to work, which are the kind of criteria that the case officer are looking at in approving or denying the applications. So we acknowledge the self-selection bias in this type of data because, and they are not likely to represent the entire population of the SSDI applicants, despite containing many observations spanning more than a decade. And looking at one aspect of a complex process, may not capture the entire, process in terms of the complexity and the different issues that people are faced with. Nevertheless, we believe that ENA can be an important analytical tool in capturing customers' experience in negotiating the application and appeals process that is currently not captured in the surveys and administrative data. And using machine learning, we can derive meaningful topics that could be informative to SSA. And ENAs are also dynamic over time, so we could actually evaluate how conversations change in response to changes in policies and the macroeconomic environment. So with that, I look forward to the discussion and thank you for the attention this afternoon.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to turn it over for questions in just a few minutes, but I do have some questions for all of our panelists to weigh in on briefly before we move to the Q&A period. So very broadly, I'm interested in anyone's suggestions for what types of questions should SSA consider for the agency learning agenda.
This is Purvi. I'll just briefly state what we've heard throughout the afternoon, sure. Which is, how can SSA do more outreach to address the people who fell through the cracks in the last year? That was a question raised in the earlier half of the afternoon. And I think that's, I think we'd all agree that that's a very important question.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah, I think I would like to see them do some geospatial looking at where field offices are located and where there's a lack of internet service. And see, I think there's probably a big overlap there because it's rural areas that, at least it was 12 years ago, I don't know what it is now. Rural areas didn't have good internet service, and they also were the furthest from field offices. So that makes those people really hard to get service. And I know the geospatial information for the field office is available, and I believe the CPS, which collects information about internet access, would be able to get you down to a low enough level that you could do that kind of work.
Other ideas?
I was really delighted to hear about the notion of trying to capture customer experience as they are negotiating this process. I think our study clearly indicate the need for that understanding, and a lot of the kind of solutions that we are hoping to get at is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So I think having more in-depth knowledge in perhaps identifying segments of the populations where they can be better served with different sort of solutions might be a way to help us thinking about how should we prioritize the services and the densities of field offices for different types of population segments, as well as the processes in terms of the application, the medical exam evidence forms that we can, I think a lot of our findings certainly points to specific pinch points where that kind of solutions is probably much more effective to address those as opposed to trying to revamp the entire system. So I think there are opportunities there that we can perhaps look at with more in-depth qualitative type of study.
Great. Other ideas? I've got one that I'd like to hear your feedback about. Amir and Erica may tell me if this is a crazy idea, but I think that as over the years, and we hear more and more about the kinds of impairments or the kind of conditions that people have, and that they may need more help than others due to their conditions, their circumstances, their language, all of the things our advocates talked about first off in this discussion. I'm wondering, as there seems to be obviously these folks use all kinds of services, whether it be federal services, state services, county services. How can they find ways to kind of synergize those services so that, say, for example, if someone has a housing issue, there might be someone from SSA there as well to cover questions in that area. How do they better find those services and how they're being provided and where they're being provided, so that they can tap into that area or what's out there and what's existing to make things more easy for their customers?
That's a great question. I don't know if you're asking if we think they should include that, or if, I think on their learning agenda. I think that's an important question that we see in this space. I think we see it in lots of spaces. I have a background in child welfare. Children in foster care touch many different systems. And I think it is always a challenge, given the way our government is structured, given the funding programs. Even within agencies, we don't have these opportunities. But I think there are things that agencies have done and could continue to do. For example, co-location of services is something that has been tried. I personally haven't dug into that literature. I'm more familiar with it on the TANF side, on the public assistance side. But I think this is some of the things that we are actually hoping to get at. For folks that don't know, OMB issued a request for information, I think 2 weeks ago now, related to the equity EO. And it relates, I promise. And I think the point there is, we are asking a lot for people to give us a lot of information. But one of the things that we are trying to understand is kind of what are those barriers and how we might think about service delivery a little bit different, including opportunities to, streamline applications or have applications cover multiple service systems. I think some states have done a much better job of this than we have at the federal government. And we need to be cognizant that in some spaces, states and localities are the ones implementing these services, not just the feds. So it's complicated. I'd love to see more work done there. And, I think we all want to get there. If it was easy, we'd have done it already, I think.
Yeah. Another area that could be of interest is what factors would need to be considered when researching the impact of third-party support. We heard about that from our advocate friends this first off, including but not limited to professional representation. That seems to be more and more these folks need help, and finding factors that researching some factors relative to that could be helpful. Even how SSA could research the efficacy of its outreach efforts. We talked about that briefly, and how well its service channels meet the different needs of different groups of people, not only in terms of face-to-face, but clearly in terms of online services as well as telephone services as well. The Census Pulse survey identifies a share of people who delayed applying for benefits during COVID-19. Does anyone have any thoughts about how could SSA study the impact of those across varied populations? That's another idea that our staff had raised.
I mean, while you can't study in SSA administrative data, the population that hasn't applied, because you don't see them, you could look at trends over time and see, if there's sharp changes in particular groups or parts of the country or, rural and urban areas to infer. Yeah.
Great.
I did a lot of thinking about this over the last few days, and I don't know how we get at the people, the quote underserved people, because they don't come to the office. We don't know who's underserved. And the only way to do is some kind of outreach research with some kind of survey. And my guess is it would have to be an in-person survey, and it would have to be a scientific sample if you want to get a good idea. Maybe start with a pilot in an urban area and in a rural area, just to see what people know, what people know how to access, how they would access. But I don't see, as Purvi said, unless if they've already come into the office, they're out of our purview of interest. We need to be able to get the people that we haven't had contact with, and the people that need the services. And I think it's more than just using advocacy groups to identify them, because I think there's a lot of people that never come into contact with the advocacy groups.
That's
so,
right.
I think a major project needs to be planned for that one.
One of the things I've heard from communities of color in terms of disability is that sort of embracing disability identity can vary across communities. And so you're not going to go to an advocacy group if you don't think that you have a disability, and maybe the fact that you are alone with your disability and that you're not connected to a community makes you harder to find. And so one of the things that I've heard is that you need to go to, not to disability service providers, but you need to go to the communities. So go to low income communities that were hit by COVID, if it's COVID focused, where that there are going to be people with disabilities, because there's people with disabilities everywhere, but go to them instead of waiting for them to come to you. And even if that means you don't have a scientific sample that's representative, if you always are just going to first choose the best sampling method, it might get in the way of getting the information you want.
I think building on the combination of what Purvi and Scott just said, start with something where you have this geographic information and you can look at where, if you see changes at a local level where there have been changes, say you had a high share of the population that had been Hispanic among applicants in the past, or trying to do some of the work that we've done before, linking geographic information, administrative data, look at what we see, look for patterns over time. And if that tells you places where you can narrow in, then go in and, whether it's a pilot, whether it's something that's more scientific, depending on what you find, then try to go in and find out, really what's going in there. I think quantitative information can give you some of the ideas of where to narrow your focus, but I think you really do have to go in with a different lens and try to understand really what, particularly for underserved populations, what are the challenges, what are the barriers? And I don't think you can really easily get that from any sort of national survey. I mean, the NBS has some information about beneficiary challenges, but it really wouldn't get at this population.
I would just add 2 points quickly. The first, and this is just a good OMB bureaucrat in me, the pulse surveys are, the first time the census has really done this kind of quick turn type of work. And so, we hope that agencies use them. The data are, available. There's lots that you can glean from them. So, they are imperfect potentially for some of the things that you may want to look at, but we do hope they get some play and people use them. The second thing I would just say is that we at OMB are really taking a deliberate approach on stakeholder engagement. I think it's a little bit different than outreach perhaps, but that, folks are really focused on meaningful stakeholder engagement, recognizing that a lot of the things that we do, and RFI included, may not necessarily reach the people that we want to be reaching. So really emphasizing deliberate and concerted stakeholder engagement, that kind of maybe gets into those nooks and crannies where we're not bringing people in through other channels.
Great. How about Kristen, Kate, or Bethany? Do you have any suggestions to add in terms of things that the types of questions you think SSA should consider for their agency learning agenda?
Well, I think that I just want to point out one thing that Scott mentioned earlier is that Social Security does not have reliable racial data about beneficiaries and claimants. And I think that's a real shortcoming. I think that really hampers a lot of analysis that they need to be able to do. So I would like to say that that should be at the top of the agency's learning agenda right there.
Mhm. Thank you, Kate. But Kristen or Bethany, any thoughts?
I just want to amplify everything Kate said. I feel like that is absolutely in the advocacy community, the top line priority is to really, it's really hard to think about how to address racial equity if you don't know who is suffering harms and in what way. So I feel like that is absolutely the top line priority. I think the other thing I would say, and I really appreciated the conversation about the different state analysis and thinking about where states are doing different work. I know we have seen both reflected in some data and also certainly among anecdotally heard a lot of difference in how pandemic era flexibility has been provided by state DDSs. And particularly in the cessation context, have heard anecdotally of a lot of differences. And also, I think, as I said, some of the data shows that states have very different rates, and that may reflect consultative examinations. I think maybe my guess is maybe not entirely. I think some of it just might be culture, and I think you can maybe learn a lot about cultures from that data.
I'll just echo that if we're going to also be aiming at outreach to populations, having the racial and ethnic data and reliable racial and ethnic data is going to be a hugely important piece of that. I mean, I think SSA does a decent job now of understanding how to reach some of their folks in terms of like knowing when to put it on Spanish language radio, when to put it in other contexts where if you have limited English proficiency, it's easier, thinking about visual learning on Instagram and things related to that. But if we don't know who we're targeting, I mean, this is something we're also running into in the broader disability space in the context of home and community-based services. And are folks even aware that this is an option? And I think that was a discussion I really appreciated because it echoes a lot of discussions that I've had in the past few months.
I also really appreciated the conversation about data sharing and program alignment and easing paths. I think there's a lot of things that make a lot of sense when we think about really clear like Medicaid utilization and Medicaid services, particularly in the home and community-based services context. If somebody has a home health aide 40 hours a week, it's probably unlikely that they're going to be able to sustain full-time employment, and there's not a lot of overlap in assessment between those two determinations. And so I know there's a lot of HIPAA issues, and I really appreciate that SSA is already starting to think through a lot of those in pilots and on a smaller scale. But I think there's so much that could be done in terms of streamlining, to Jonathan's point around streamlining eligibility determinations, that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. And I just think there's a lot to explore.
Especially around children and IEP services and SSI. That's a piece that I don't think there's been nearly enough research into, and that I think is a very logical place to start when you're trying to find folks that might be eligible for the program, but don't know about it necessarily.
And then to make a plug, then the racial data becomes really important, because we also know there's a lot of racial discrepancies in who gets IEPs. So then thinking really hard about how to use both sets of data to ensure that people aren't, that there isn't a disparate impact of that, and that children of color aren't, and particularly Black children aren't then, treated worse by these efficiencies.
Great. All righty, let me open it up first to our board members. I know we've got a lot of questions that our audience has been asking that I'd like to try to get to, but let me start with the board members. Do any of our board members have any questions or any particular issue they'd like to weigh in on?
So let me ask a question on the last issue that was discussed about collecting racial and ethnic data. Do you think that SSA is the right agency to collect this data, or should it be collected by other agencies such as Census or BLS to do analysis of the extent of benefit take-up by different groups and what we are missing. As someone observed just now, once a person is approached and contacted SSA, that's not the population of interest. So SSA's collection of this data on similarly on racial and ethnic information is not really going to help your cause, I think. There has to be a special effort by an agency which is experienced in doing such surveys and compiling information and having it processed enough for research. That should be, what do you think of that idea?
So census already does collect this information, right? And we've seen that it's inadequate to answer some of the questions that we're talking about.
No, I understand that it might be inadequate what census does, but in particular, would it become adequate if SSA did that? I have my doubts, which is why I was asking that.
Well, you know, I just think it's worth the effort.
Well,
so obviously we disagree about that.
I'll have more to say during my discussion, but okay.
Mm-hmm. Let me jump in because I was actually going to say the sort of the reverse of what Jagadish said, and that is that it used to be that as part of the enumeration in the hospitals, there was racial data was collected, and that, you know, that has a lot of uses because it's then identified with a particular number, and obviously you have to keep the information confidential. And that stopped, I think, about a decade ago. And of course, it would take a very long time to get complete racial data, even if you introduced it, because you've got a large population that doesn't have it, and then you have to introduce it. But that always struck me as the gold standard. I know they've tried to get it from census, and it just hasn't been effective. But given how high a priority it is, I mean, again, I don't know if people who've worked with SSA have a sense about it. I thought it was cost that caused them to stop.
I just wanted to just note that, you know, Bethany, Kate, and I have been sort of a little bit like not fully in the weeds on this in the way that some of our partners have, but we do have lots of partners who've spent a lot of time thinking about this with people who've done data collection, not necessarily about, you know, being able to like immediately magically enumerate and reverse or anything, but to think about how to do sampling and how to really get at the answers, which is how are we underserving people in ways that we don't intend? And so to the extent that the people have questions after that, I would love, and I'm sure Kate and Bethany, we can make connections to people who have really thought about this in very smart ways.
Yeah, I know there, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not just underserved, it's also discriminatory in the way that the service is provided. You know, you'd have to look at outcomes and one racial lines, but I'm sorry, go ahead, let the experts speak.
No, I'm definitely not an expert in this. I was actually going to mention that I'm not an expert in something, but there has been work that's been done, I think, for people working for CMS, where they've tried to use local level information to impute race at a very fine level. Obviously, I don't think that solves the problem long term, and that's not what we would want, but I think there may be short-term ways that the agency could consider using some of these methods that have been used by other agencies to try to understand the population a little bit better. That doesn't answer the question of who should collect the data longer term, but I think there may be ways sort of as an intermediate step to try to get pretty accurate, you know, real-time data for the people that they don't have the information since it stopped being part of the verification system or hasn't been reported through SSA means.
Mm-hmm. Years ago, there was some talk about whether it was possible to use the census data and match it to our records. You know, and there were really, it was really difficult legally. It was really difficult for trying to match names without social security numbers and that kind of thing. So it has been thought about. There is some racial data. I mean, I've heard complaints about disability decisions because most of the disability folders have some kind of evidence in it that states the race, and so they're not necessarily racially blind. So again, this is people we've already worked with, but you might be able to get some race out of the disability folders. But I don't, other than developing new surveys with race questions, I don't know how we're going to be able to get that. And I believe the race the race stopped getting collected, if I'm not mistaken, in 1986 when we went to enumeration at birth. And it was not collected at the hospital, or at least it wasn't required at the hospital. But I'd have to look back at that.
And that's actually, I think you're right about that. I think I misstated it.
Just really quickly, I wanted to make sure folks were aware the Racial Equity EO includes a requirement for an equitable data working group. That group is actually, you're all raising very interesting points and things that people have wrestled with about data sharing and things like that. And that group is actually undertaking a number of activities to try to get at some of these challenges that we've talked about with race and ethnicity data. So, I don't want to overpromise, but that is certainly part of what we are doing as part of the implementation of that executive order.
Great, Erica. A follow-up question for you, and I know it's early in the process, but are there examples where learning agenda efforts have resulted in modernizing program operations?
This is a good question. So I will just say that learning agendas are a new requirement for nearly all agencies. Prior to the passage of the act, I can think of maybe about 4 agencies that had one. I would love to know what you mean modernization of the program operations. I will say that in the human services space, the maternal and infant early childhood home visiting program, I'm going to call it MICV and save myself some breath, has had a learning agenda for a long time that has laid out questions about implementation, about program operations, about impact, and they have used things like continuous quality improvement, performance, and evaluation to really build and feed in and kind of do that cyclical work. So probably not exactly what you're going for, but I think it's early, and that's exactly what we hope to see happen here across agencies.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some really good examples. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Kim, you may remember the work incentive specialist that was implemented, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And that sort of came from learning, the advocacy groups were trying to get us to do a better job training our staff in the work incentives. And what happened was we didn't have enough staff. We couldn't even get one work incentive specialist per office. They had other duties to do. And so workload problems and lack of staff really hurt that initiative. And that would have been, it would have been good to have somebody be able to explain that, but we've never been able to fully implement it. I don't know how it is now, but when we're starting it 10 years ago, it was really slow getting off the ground.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Bob, any questions?
First of all, I want to thank everybody for this enormous amount of information and useful thinking. And where that leads me is to think about really carefully defining underservice, and particularly in the rural areas and in the area of the disability community, since it is so, the disability community is different than the beneficiary community, of course, or at least those individuals are. So I'm wondering, for those particularly who work in the disability rights area, if you think Social Security has a role in defining the disability, the disability identity. I hope that isn't too broad a question, but it's an important one to me. I will take that as a no.
So sorry, could you repeat the question just slightly?
I'm sorry. In terms of identifying underserved populations, the disability community is oftentimes cited as a underserved community, and yet in this world of Social Security, as I understand it, there's people who receive benefits and people who don't receive benefits due to their disability. So when we start talking about identifying communities, it seems to me like there's a difference between in the role of Social Security as it perceives itself as a organization that distributes benefits, as opposed to how a disability person who's a member of the disability community might perceive that community. That's so
Yeah.
It seems like a cognitive dissonance to me as you've been discussing it in terms of what Social Security does and how they would identify particular populations.
I think that it's an interesting question, because if you take, for instance, before I joined the ARC, I represented people with serious mental illness and worked for the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. And within the consumer survivor movement, there is an extensive discussion about whether or not to use the label disabled, which I think has also come up across various conversations we've had. Social Security and other legal systems tend to use definitions, and I would actually say that the most common definition of disability is in fact the Social Security disability definition, which is complicated and actually not the most helpful, because it's a very, very narrow definition. It means that you have to have that work limitation, which means that that very severe work limitation. And so I think about people who might not have gone through the whole disability determination process, but have a serious mental illness. Medicaid expansion did, because of the Medicaid expansion, we have a slightly broader category, which would be the medically fragile category. And states have kind of started to separate out a population of folks who have a chronic condition, or the Medicaid system data suggests that they have that additional kind of burden of having a disability. Within the broader disability community, there are novels to be written about how people would prefer to define the community and all of that. So I'll defer on that. But I think when it comes to like the legal definitions, the SSI standard or the Social Security disability standard is probably the most commonly used among federal programs. And I think it is honestly too narrow to capture a lot of folks who have need limitation or have functional limitations that we need to be meeting.
And Bob, there's
in our research.
Please go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say there's a couple things that brought up. I don't know if this is perfectly responsive, but I think it gets at maybe some of what you're asking. It's something that, you know, in the like direct service practitioner community, we like really struggle with a lot, is how the SSI program is not a strengths-based program, right? It's not an empowering program. It focuses on people's worst days. And then it asks, especially in situations like behavioral health and trauma, it asks people to sort of perform their trauma in a really harmful way. And it feels awful. And it feels awful to our clients. It feels awful to us to ask them to do it. I think, and we could have an entire conversation, and I would love to have this conversation about how to create a program that is empowering and is strengths-based and doesn't do more harm to people who, in the instance of trauma, have experienced harm. And I think that's part of what underlines a lot of the call for us to do, to try to figure out some of the racial equity pieces and to really drill down in that. And I guess, and the other response, the other thing I wanted to say that's something we think about a lot and are grapple with and don't have good answers, is that I think when you think about who's represented in these spaces, you know, there's a lot of tension about me as a person without lived experience being that person. And I think even among disability advocates, there are wonderful advocates, but they are not always, their interests are not always represented in these spaces, even when they're bringing their lived experiences. And I will give you an example, which is that we have a lot of clients who have lifelong mental health disabilities, who become incarcerated for more than 12 months, who lose SSI, and then just spend years trying to reconnect to benefits and have a lot of harm because they can't reconnect because of rules around being cut off benefits. And those folks just aren't even in the spaces around people with lived experiences. So we're constantly thinking about how to bring them in a way that also honors the fact that they're dealing with a lot of stuff, including trying to get SSI. And I think it's just like really important conversations to just keep having.
Well, so, your answers were much better than my question. Thank you.
I wanted to say something about that too, and that the point was made that we have a very narrow definition of disability, and we've never had much luck in the research area with mapping survey questions into disability status. You know, they don't match very well. Even the most severe questions don't get at the disability population. And just as we did some past work on 100% disabled veterans. So they were basically permanently and totally disabled. When they applied to SSA for their benefits, their allowance rate was just a hair higher than the average applicant, non-veteran applicant. So even for veterans' definition of disability, we have a very narrow definition of disability. So it's really hard to even identify the disabled population out there that would be interacting with us on getting benefits from us.
Thanks.
Great, thank you, Scott. Peggy, I know that you have your hand up. Peggy is one of our technical experts from the field. Peggy, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I think I raised my hand a couple of questions back, but I wanted to share the information that we do collect racial data on our enumeration applications in the office and in the mail when we complete those applications, but that information is voluntary. So we ask if they would like to provide that information. So I just didn't want the conversation to continue about that without you having that fact. And then in the discussion about vulnerable populations, I would be remiss if I didn't say that it really does matter at the local level if we know who our customers are and we have relationships in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And during the COVID time, and I'm representing the managers across the whole nation. And so, and I'll just digress for a minute and talk about my own service area, but I'm in Montana in a very rural area, and I have 4 Indian reservations in my service area. And I had the opportunity to testify a couple of weeks ago on the Senate Finance Committee and talk about really how proud I am that we have been able to be more nimble than I would have ever expected SSA to be, as far as being able to take care of our claimants, take care of appointments over the phone. We've talked a lot about being closed, and we went home on a Friday, and on Monday we were taking all of those same claims, but it just was by phone. And the video service delivery I have set up on my reservations has been great for that vulnerable population. Vulnerable because of poverty level, because of transportation issues, sometimes access to medical care. We have video service delivery, but where we ran into a hiccup was that the IHS clinics were also closed because of the pandemic. So the folks that would normally be on the other end to help on a face-to-face basis, they weren't there either. So there was no interaction, but we've done a really good job of trying to just continue to help people through the phone. And there's a 150 things that you've said on this panel today of improvements. And one thing that I wish I had gotten to say a couple of weeks ago when I testified was we can talk a lot about simplifying the SSI application and the forms, but the actual program itself has to be changed. And if we could get bipartisan support to make some changes for SSI simplification, because we're doing an awful lot of talking about our most vulnerable customers, and the agency is too, and they're looking for outreach opportunities, and they're making that a priority. However, the most vulnerable people that we serve have the most complex program to navigate. And so these people that when they do get on, we're still requiring them to come in and report their income and report their birthday money earnings and report who moved in the house and who moved out of the house and continuously stay in contact with us. And that's a nightmare for anybody to navigate, but especially for our most vulnerable people, that's definitely a problem. So at this point, when I'm hearing all of the things SSA could be doing, what I would want so much is that we have a program that we can administer, that we have the IT to do, and we have a program that we do business with our customers the way that they want to do business. So if our customers want to come in face-to-face, they should have that option. And if they want phone, and if they want online, or if they want an app, the customers are who we need to find out how they want to interact with us. And then we need to take that information and make that available. That's where our learning model should come from, is what do the customers need? Why is it, what's so hard about SSI? What's a struggle, and what has been a struggle in getting a hold of somebody or filling out forms? That's the kind of information we really should collect. And again, I'm speaking about a couple of different topics, but I'll stop right there and just say that being out in the field and actually doing this while all of our customers are at home, our employees are at home. And so who's in the office right now are the managers across the nation who are trying to be there for those dire need individuals. And in my office, I'm seeing dire need people every single day.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Peggy. Any other questions from board members? One question maybe for Amira and Erica has to do with, as Peggy, as you can hear from Peggy, the employees have a lot of great ideas. The Federal Employee View Survey is one vehicle that collects information about how federal employees are thinking. In your view, for agencies, if they're does the way that they're treated by their agencies improve the way that employees provide services to the public? And have there been any studies done regarding this linkage?
I'm really grateful for this question, and I know that it was not planted, but we actually have a public article that I would be more than happy to share with folks around a study that we did, because absolutely, I think this connection between employee experience and customer experience is one that the private sector has been hooked on for decades, and that in government we've been a bit slower to take up, or at least, do the analysis around. And last year, we actually took the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey results from TSA, as well as the equivalent that the Veterans Health Administration runs, and mapped data on employee engagement to customer complaint data to see if there was any kind of correlation. And we did find a correlation between employee engagement and in customer complaint data. So we think that that is some, not always 100% causal, and obviously more work to be done there. But I think that it's at least an amazing indicator light to look and see, like, where are there places where some type of intervention might be needed. And I think we also saw some really interesting regional trends. We saw some different things, that I think make it, that type of analysis just puts data into the hands of like local level managers that can actually use that. A lot of times in the federal government, we're always just looking at these massive aggregate data sets and trends that aren't super actionable. But I think looking at, in particular for an agency like SSA that has such like a geographic reach and has field offices, you can look at individual engagement scores within field offices and complaints or other satisfaction. Like if you have a really good customer feedback mechanism set up at the field office level, you can connect those. So happy to share that article. And I think that's a really interesting idea for SSA to pursue.
Great, great. Very good. Very good. All righty. I want to make sure that we give Jagadish enough time for his closing discussant remarks. So Jagadish, I'm going to turn it over to you. And but before I do, just very briefly, thank you to all of you for your time today. Can't say thank you enough. You've been terrific. This has been a great discussion and we really appreciate it. So Jagadish.
Thank you very much. Thank you, obviously, to all the participants of the roundtable. I think the discussion generated a lot of insights into what we need to do, what happened during COVID, how to address complex issues related to vulnerable populations and so on. But before I launch into some observations, obviously I will not be able to touch on every issue that was raised because of time limits. I must first address the issue of a disclaimer that most of these events that we hold are for information for the board to absorb. This is not an output of the board, but I am a board member, so I should also make the disclaimer that these are my comments and should not be attributed to the board as a whole. Well, I think since the morning we've had a whole panoply of presentations and discussions. The formal presentations by researchers, the first session, I think all the presentations were succinct, as I said before, precisely focused, and provide useful information about disability application rates, why they have continued to decline, what were the intuitively consistent results and what were kind of surprising results, and so on. So the issue is, what does the discussion, not just that discussion, but the entire day's discussion reveal? What are the messages that we should think about, issues to consider, and so on? So at the outset, obviously, I think everybody appreciates that any agency's policy settings on service delivery, to the extent that it has flexibility and control over such policy settings, don't happen in a vacuum. There is obviously an environment that imposes constraints on what the agency can do and cannot do. Obviously, those constraints are based on what the program law says, what that law generates by way of public demands for services that need to be met, and also the budget constraints that the agencies face. And then there is the current state of the agency in terms of its service infrastructure that exists. Its physical facilities and equipment and human capital and skills and experience and so on, that will affect the agency's ability to just deliver on its charge. In this context, there are obviously, as was mentioned, a couple of particular elements in that environment. Currently, obviously, the Evidence Act, which requires decisions to be grounded in empirical evidence and provides a framework for evidence building to assist in all facets of policymaking. That's one issue, which involves the development of a learning agenda, a regular reporting framework, and so on, to reveal the areas of improvements that SSA should consider, and then consider for its information collection and evaluation activities. This discussion, especially the latter discussion, has revealed that there are a lot of gaps that still need to be filled. My sense, I've been a board member for 12 years now, and my sense is gathering data to facilitate business operations is the priority at SSA. But gathering data for research, gathering and processing data to make it available for research and analysis, which requires its own battery of processing steps, seems to be a second order priority at SSA. From what we heard this morning before the roundtable began, though, it seems the agency has begun to engage in rectifying this shortfall. And we just have to wait and see how far that process will go. A second requirement, which was also mentioned appropriately, was the requirement of transparency. In order to share performance metrics and performance outcomes, I would say on a public dashboard, so that everybody who is interested in SSA policy, either as a beneficiary or potential claimant or interested researcher or policy practitioner, would be able to evaluate and contribute to the evaluation of successes, and then contribute to the identification of where improvements need to be made. So transparency is another, I think, important consideration, which I'm not sure how SSA's declarations of its performance metrics stand in comparison with other agencies, but obviously something that is important in this process. A second element in the environment is that SSA has been classified as a high impact service provider. My idea of what that meant was a little different compared to what was explained in the discussion, so that was obviously helpful. But obviously, I think that is a source, being a high impact service provider is the source for its bias towards business operations as opposed to research. Although that shouldn't be the case, I think, well, that's what it seems to be. Consistent service delivery and constant improvement efforts are key, but the constant improvement efforts is, I think, hampered by this bias against, not against, but a second-rate priority attribution to business intelligence, data collection, evaluation, and so on. So I think it's quite appropriate that we have now a framework for the Evidence Act, and the framework for a learning agenda obviously is very important. And hopefully it'll prod and push the agency like SSAs to move in the right direction. Now, COVID-19 happened. So this discussion has to be in the context, and it's obviously raised many issues, and I'll just touch on a few. It raises the issue of looking at SSA's contingency planning. I think the three presentations that were related to what happened under COVID reveal some important ideas, important clues. Ms. Kurda's presentation suggested two key shortfalls. One was in the equipment that was initially in the communications equipment that needed to be provided for effectively remoting workloads. And then the shortfall on consultative examinations. That was this was a particularly challenging health episode, adverse health episode. And so consultative examination, which were prevented because of cessation of in-person contact, meant SSA had difficulties. But I gather that SSA has been consistent in its attempts to rectify those shortfalls. And this is evidenced by the consistently positive trend in its service completion and caseload processing frequency over the months since COVID started. Overall, I think SSA is to be commended for the rapid adjustments that it made to conserve and preserve its service delivery function despite the heavy challenges that COVID presented. The second, Steve Goss's presentation suggests that this has been a decline in the applications on disability has been a long-term trend, since 2010. They've observed a secular trend in declining application rates. And except for a slight uptick observable in the data in 2019, that trend seems to have continued. And then the Sarah Smith and other co-authors speculated, I should say, on a lot of reasons why that might be the case. The provision of stimulus payments and extension of unemployment benefits and so on. Workers being able to fall back on their savings or having a wait and see attitude towards the uncertainty generated by the new environment and so on. But all these still remain speculative. And hopefully the work in progress will help us dig deeper into the relative contributions of these alternative potential explanations to what led to a consistent declining applications, consistent with past trends, but not consistent with what we expect to happen. So Social Security obviously does engage in contingency planning. But I'm tempted to say, and I think this is reasonable, that this was a black swan event. It was a massive national event. And you cannot reasonably insure against these type of events. And let me just point to the case of what's going on in India, my home country, before I migrated to the US many years ago. We are seeing shortages of oxygen supply and hospital personnel and hospitals themselves and capacity for intensive care units and so on. Nobody in their reasonable minds would have provided for that type of ramp up or that type of excess capacity to be hanging around, all the time as a contingency plan. Obviously, those type of shocks you cannot insure against, and then the consequences have to be dealt with by nimble and smart adjustments by the system, and even those will fall short, as is the case in India right now. This is similar, but again, let me also reiterate that I think the agency did a stellar job in adjusting and maintaining its service provision under these challenging circumstances. But there are lessons to be drawn about the weakest links in the system. And I think it would be useful for the agency to think about what those weak links are and how it might take lessons from this episode and apply it to its contingency planning. There are potentially other similar large-scale events that could happen: a cyber attack, a widespread natural, increasing frequency of natural disasters because of climate change, and even just the possibility that the virus will mutate and present new even more challenging and more transmissible variants. And we may be exposed to a third and fourth wave and so on. So it seems to me that the key lesson is that we need to have alternatives, sufficient alternatives, or at least a plan to be able to nimbly make adjustments and know in advance as to what needs to be done. And hopefully the agency has learned from this episode about what needs to be done. The discussion has, again, pointed out a lot of gaps, while acknowledging that it is difficult and there's no magic bullet, as someone said. We need to recognize that people's connection to the system of benefits by SSA and other agencies is tenuous. And we are stumbling along, hopefully in the future, not as badly as last year, as the vaccinations and so on take hold and the economy returns to normalcy, employment ramps up and so on. There is no excuse for misapplication of the rules, like I think stimulus payments, which are not supposed to count, resulting in benefit suspension or termination, I think is something that, I think that point is well taken. SSA should have been cognizant about this potentiality and prepared for it through reverse data exchanges was suggested. I think that's a very good idea. Comments about no substitution for in-person services, that has been made more starkly evident through COVID, but I think that was always the issue that people recognized even before COVID set in, that for some individuals, in-person services are it, and we need to maintain those facilities to an adequate extent in order to be able to serve vulnerable populations. There are many other comments. I won't go into the details of all notices, the digital divide and data collection for identifying vulnerable populations and so on. One issue that I raised this morning as well is measuring the efficiency of outreach efforts to vulnerable populations. We might have outreach. We might use different media like radio or distribution of advertisements in local media, newspapers, and so on about availability of benefits and raising awareness through community organizations and so on. The difficult question is, how do we evaluate how successful those efforts are being in contacting and then getting a response as we would want from vulnerable populations? Because there is really no standard of comparison here. This is something that SSA has to do and just see what we get. But how do we evaluate the success of this policy, and whether this policy is being successful to merit a repeat in the future or consistent application all along the way and so on? There are no standards for measurement. Maybe some folks here in this group or others have some ideas, and maybe we should continue this discussion along for this issue. But I at least don't have an answer about the measurement of efficiency of outreach efforts. The administration's emphasis on fair and equitable treatment that was discussed by race and ethnicity is relatively new. One of you might challenge that it is relatively new. It's always there, it's been there, but it's been, I think, brought more in focus as a result of the effects of COVID. Well, race and ethnicity data clearly are not relevant in determining eligibility or benefit levels. That's clear. But if there are disparate service rates by race and ethnicity, how would SSA even collect data? And this is to the point that was raised earlier and that I raised a question about equitable service provision in terms of case processing and adjudication and communication. And would you be able to, even if SSA had these data, and I understand that they're on a voluntary basis, even if they're made mandatory, which I don't know if you could, or there was a survey conducted, how would SSA use these data? Would SSA, what would be required of SSA in terms of measuring its service provision along racial and ethnic lines, and whether it's adequately providing services to a vulnerable population along these distinctions? I think the important point, one that Nancy raised, is we need to collect these data, I think, through other surveys, through other agencies' efforts, and then have researchers glean that information and provide it to SSA. Maybe it can happen through the DRC, I always confuse the acronym, or through census data collection or other surveys, University of Michigan or other survey collection agencies that specialize in these, to actually design and implement. But again, it's going to be a long-term effort. And then consider these data to decide on the extent to which in-person service facilities need to be additionally provided, what form they should take, how mobile they should be, or what about field office distribution across population densities and so on. This is something I've suggested for a long time. Not sure what the agency is doing about research along these lines, even with the existing data that it has. So those are still open questions, and I think we don't have any firm answers, but I think someone suggested maybe you should try something at least as a first step on this issue. Now, COVID has also generated a new focus on gathering information and measuring consumer experience, developing metrics for it, and so on. And this is also part of the Evidence Act, the Learning Agenda, and so on, as was mentioned earlier. Conversations with different groups suggest that it should be the starting point of policy evaluations. So do CX and draw conclusions from it, and then decide on policy. That is one proposal of how to go about it. But another proposal that stems from the ID modernization technical panel that the SSAB just convened and has just released its report, is that this is part of an integrated approach to how SSA conducts its various business lines. And it cannot be done in isolation with any hope of success. It requires the overall superstructure and infrastructure of an operating model, a governance structure, a strategic plan that which is not possible without having an operational model first, and case-specific or business line-specific journey maps from the point of application to the point of decision and communication of the outcome. So CX is the chance of succeeding through CX type of initiatives to glean customer experience, develop metrics, and then evaluate and analyze what they mean, or the implications. You have to have this structure in place, and it's not clear yet to us at the board to what extent there is consistent development of operational models and proper governance structures, a succession plan, and strategic planning around every business line in SSA. And whether there are exchanges of best practices across business lines. We often hear that there are smokestacks, different stacks that are enclaves in their own within SSA. So it's not clear how consistently this kind of approach is employed and used. And the chance that CX type of activity focused on CX alone is likely to succeed. A second point with regard to consumer measurement of consumer experience and using it in policy, making it policy adjustments, is that CX is a very difficult enterprise to actually do it properly, because consumers come in contact with the agency in many different contexts and for many different purposes. And we need to measure consumer experience and then encapsulate that in some understandable way, in some understandable summary metrics. And going from the collection of raw data on consumer experience at these various touch points, and then processing it and then analyzing it to make it amenable for drawing conclusions about which direction policy should go, is a challenging exercise simply because we do not know what the appropriate weights we should place on these different touch points in order to come up with our CX metrics. That is something that I don't know, doesn't really get talked about much, but it's a really important, you might say, challenge or hurdle to developing reliable and consistent and metrics that actually capture the reality on the ground that leadership or SSA managers are going to use to make their policy decisions. That's a technical issue that needs to be investigated before we, it's fine to say overall that, you need CX, but exactly how and what are the, nuts and bolts, as the devil is in the details of exactly how CX measures are constructed. Those are important issues that need to be considered. A second issue with CX is CX alone is not going to be the only objective that SSA needs to satisfy. And CX cannot be the only input into decision-making on policy. There are other objectives. For example, there might be a negative and adverse trade-off between improving on CX measures versus improving SSA's throughput. The rate, suppose SSA gets something like 2.5 million disability benefits every year. But if you want to improve CX, we need to provide these very granularly appropriate, timely, adequate, accurate services to as many applicants as we can. That takes time and resources, which may detract from how many cases we see through to completion and how big the backlog becomes. And SSA, we know, is very sensitive to backlogs developing and becoming high. So what is the trade-off between targeting improvement in CX versus more volume and throughput for SSA? If there is a negative trade-off there, we need to think about that. But who at SSA will be making the policy, and how will that policy, and what is the evidence-based policy context for making this choice? Because it's a trade-off. You could emphasize CX more or throughput more, and there's no right answer. These type of trade-offs should also be considered before you think about, just adding CX to a requirement. And the agency might, apply weights and manipulate those weights to get some desired results, which may divorce the CX overall summary CX metrics that SSA reports with the reality on the ground about how really satisfied customers are. So these are some challenging issues that need to be thought about when prescribing these frameworks for evidence-based and learning agendas and so on. additional issues, I think there needs to be, clearly the lesson is there needs to be outreach. We need to identify factors causing disparate service rates along lines of, identifying vulnerable populations, identifying service rates by race and ethnicity. There are still a lot of questions about how exactly to go about doing that and how long it will take. But obviously that's an effort that is needed, as was highlighted by this discussion. An additional, I think, useful discussion is how could we leverage new technologies, such as machine learning, to access real-time responses by stakeholders and the public who is coming into contact with SSA in order to inform SSA's decision-making and inform SSA about how well or poorly the policy implementation is going. And I think it's also useful, the suggestions to examine how individuals navigate non-SSA benefit systems, and whether it would be useful to kind of have additional data exchanges with other agencies to figure out what they're doing in terms of identifying their needy populations, and whether we can draw any lessons from those exchanges. So let me kind of end there. It's kind of an open-ended discussion. Again, thanks to all the panelists and the participants to add their ideas and share their research outcomes. And we look forward to continuing to talk with you and gain information for the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jagadish. And again, I echo Jagadish's remarks. Thank you to everyone. We really appreciate your feedback today and the time and all of the work that you put into your presentation. So thanks again and have a great night. Bye-bye.
Bye.